Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Things go awry when the forces of chaos recruit a new dungeon master. From underpaid pseudo-taxi driver to underground murder labyrinth builder, one young lady's life is getting turned upside down. Chapter 1. The Day-O of Doug. Yep, he was still in the back seat. Unlike an innocuous hitchhiker ghost, this fucker didn't intend to leave before we reached his destination. Looking in my rear view for the 15th time didn't make him any less creepy. I tried to play it off like I was checking traffic. Goths, punk rockers, construction workers, I drove anyone who summoned me through the app. I wasn't put off by rough people and rarely felt even a single butterfly in my stomach. I wasn't easily spooked. The guy in my back seat was something else. Cold sweat dampened my back every time I glanced back at him. His clothes didn't bother me. Overall he had a clean-cut kind of look. Real middle American, nobody in jeans and a hoodie. I hadn't looked twice when he first got in my car. A couple of minutes in though I'd started to feel uneasy. He hadn't played along when I tried to make small talk and just sat quietly in the middle. That was weird on its own, people normally sat next to one of the doors. Then I noticed a smell. It wasn't the usual pothead thinks he covered it up with cologne scent. My nose was dead to that. This was a note of ammonia over vinegar and decay. Like old sweat and something sinister. Instinctive alarm bells went off and I looked in the rear view for the first time. That was when I got a good look at his face. It wasn't special, a bland kind of almost handsome with a touch of baby fat. The problem was his eyes. Hard but vacant and a touch too close together. The kind that got you a permanent creeper label in high school. I wanted to abort the ride immediately. I could live with losing out on $12.50 after taxes and fees and a bad rating. The problem was we were in a residential area. The street lighting was shit and nobody was walking around. I had a small tire iron beside my seat for emergencies, but fighting wasn't ideal. Not in a place like this. I needed to kick him out somewhere with witnesses in case it got ugly. I glanced at his destination, it was in the city center. I steeled my resolve and kept driving. Things didn't get better. The smell intensified as he started smiling and occasionally snickering. My stomach lurched when he slipped a hand in his hoodie pouch and started fondling something. He was either touching himself or had a knife. Neither thing would have been good. The fact that I wanted it to be the former instead of the latter was a clear indicator of how fucking awful my decision to pick him up had been. A decision I had made because I thought I was smarter than Doug. Doug of the Grateful Dead t-shirt. The veteran driver who made sure that I wouldn't veer into oncoming traffic or creep out passengers. He had spent a whole half hour with me before signing off on my employment after only driving 3 blocks. Doug had seemed like a stoner with a shit work ethic. I wish I had listened to Doug. Doug knew what was up. Hey, listen. Doug had giggled at his joke. I sat staring at him, hoping he'd get out of my car already. He hadn't noticed my vibe and stared into the middle distance over my shoulder when he continued. Don't pick up clean-cut dudes after midnight, he'd said. When I didn't respond he nodded in agreement with himself. Why? I'd asked. The idea confused me so much I forgot that I wanted him to leave, not impart baked wisdom. Instead, I was racking my brain, trying to figure out what reference he was mangling. Because only serial killers and evangers are out that late. Them and alchies. Alchies are cool if they tip, Doug said sagely. I'd nodded, only half listening. Groovy, I'd said. Doug nodded and finally got out of my car. I watched him walk back toward his own but felt like something was amiss. That the world was a little less complete when he got in instead of unfolding a razor scooter with a practiced snap. Ride-share driving wasn't easy. You got a wide cross-section of humanity in the back seat of your car every day. One that didn't have a car or a friend to drive them and usually wasn't happy about paying you to do it. I'd have gladly traded the guy in my back seat for the angriest of my normal passengers. Even the one who'd shattered my windshield because I'd said no problem after he said thank you as he exited my car. I looked back again and caught a metallic glint. He definitely wasn't touching himself. My mind scrambled for some way to not end up stabbed to death. I wasn't fond of math. Ending up a statistic would be adding insult to injury. Insult to murder? It didn't matter, but panic insisted that tangents needed my attention resources too. If I'd had the brain cells to spare, this could have become the moment I found religion. Instead, I was scanning the streets as we approached the busier bar-laden section of the city. There was no way to know, but my money was on him trying to slit my throat when I parked. I wasn't going to give him the opportunity. Once I saw a crowd, I was going to pull over and bail immediately. As I made up my mind, a warning message popped up on my heads-up display. The heads-up display I didn't have because those weren't real outside of movies. Kill one person to qualify. That was all it said. Staring at it, I heard a delighted cackle from the back seat but didn't register it as essential. I only had eyes for the impossible sign on my windshield. Something about the incongruity of it had my heart hammering in my chest. An animal part of my brain was screaming in fear. This was worse than the guy in my back seat. A lot worse. He was a piece of shit, but a human one. What I was looking at wasn't right on a fundamental level. It did not belong. Somehow, I managed to tear my eyes away. Routine or some sixth sense reminding me I'd had my eyes off the road too long. I looked through the message to the street ahead and my heart seized. I was heading for a busy pedestrian crossing. My panic and fear seemed to evaporate as my thoughts crystallized. There wasn't enough room to brake. Everyone I was looking at was mid-bar crawl and too slow to realize I was barreling toward them. It was my fault they were in danger, mine, not the freak in the back seat. I took a deep breath and whipped the wheel hard to the right. There was a weightless moment as I exhaled and my car hopped the curb. Gravity returned as my car slammed into the telephone pole I'd been aiming for. I was flung violently to the end of my seatbelt slack, colliding with the steering wheel. The crash overloaded my senses, from the squealing agony of crushed metal and glass to the scent of burning engine fluids. Everything about it was etched into my mind. Even the soft brush of skin and fabric as something flew by me. A falsetto scream whipped past as my passenger flew through where the windshield had been a moment earlier. Time moved slowly, stretching his shallow arc out across an eternity as I watched his confusion blossom into wide-eyed terror. He struck my hood with a dull boom that didn't halt his flight. He slid off it with a screech of friction to ragdoll across the sidewalk. His limbs were twisted into unnatural angles when he finally stopped, slamming into a storefront. The creepy fuck hadn't had his seatbelt on. The world felt like it was spinning and my body was a single leaden mass of pain. My vision was blurred and my thoughts jumbled, but I could still see the message clearly. It had changed. Congratulations. Kills, 1. It said in its impersonal red letters. It looked like a shitty sans serif font. The sort I'd have gotten a dirty look from my professor for using in a project. Ah, the art degree. The financial black hole I'd been busting my ass to pay for. The number 1 in the message wasn't stable. It shimmered before settling on 2. That didn't last long. It started flickering again as I began to lose consciousness. It was hard just to keep my eyes open, but I forced myself to. Despite everything, I put my last few ounces of energy into focusing. I looked past the message and to the sidewalk in front of my car. Bathed in sodium orange street light, my passenger was lying in an unnatural pile on the ground. His eyes stared unblinking forward at nothing. I smiled, satisfied even as I tasted blood. Fuck him. Chapter 2. Dazed and interviewed. Sitting in the quiet wake of the crash, I felt rather peaceful. It was over and I'd prevailed, despite the cost. There wasn't anything left to do now. My eyes fluttered, heavy with sleep I was reluctant to give into. I knew nothing good would come of it, but I didn't have the strength to fight. My adrenaline was spent, and I couldn't even move enough to stop the steering wheel from digging into my cheek. My eyes closed slowly, brows knit in dissatisfaction. Instead of darkness, I found a formless soft white glow awaiting me. It enveloped me in a vague sense of heat I couldn't quite match with my body. Like when I ran a high fever, all I could sense was warmth and an ebbing pain. There was no way to keep time, and I wasn't inclined to. Caught in a state between waking and sleep, my mind was aware but disinterested. The apathetic state replaced the agonizing injuries with comfortable numbness. As even the feeling of warmth faded from my dulled sense, I gradually noticed faint colors appearing. They began as only the lightest of tints but resolved into blurry outlines. I was looking at someone or something seated on a throne. Whether there was a meaningful difference between the seat and occupant wasn't something my mind could parse. Adequate, came a whisper in my mind. Without warning, everything snapped to black. The feeling of falling greeted me when I woke up. My head swam as I tried to understand why I was looking at the world wrong. I slept on my side and knew the details of my studio apartment's left side more intimately than my parents' faces. I was sitting up, I realized. I also wasn't at home but sitting in a high-backed office chair. All of that was weird enough on its own, but as moments ticked by, I started to remember what happened. That I'd woken up after what happened was a surprise, all things considered. That I was sitting in an office rather than a hospital bed was also strange but less critical. It took a couple of moments for me to get over my relief at being alive. I basked in the simple pleasure of existence, then remembered what happened. There was no way I wouldn't have been waking up in an ICU, if at all. It was time I started looking at my surroundings a bit closer. I was seated at a beautiful desk in a comfy chair with an expensive-looking carpet under it. The guy in the robe had a nicer chair, but that was to be expected. Whoever owned the office would have the best seat. The logic was simple enough. That all of this was floating in a swirling abyss didn't have such an obvious explanation. We ask for 1 kill. She gives us 3. Including herself? Nice initiative, a guy in a hooded robe said. I looked at him. He hadn't noticed I was conscious and was still reading through a file. I couldn't see his face. He'd turned half to the side to lean on his elbow as he read. The idea that I was, in fact, dead and this was some form of afterlife occurred to me. My last memory was a car wreck and the taste of blood. Contrary to martial arts movies, you didn't cough that up unless something was seriously wrong. Following that thought was a profound sense of disappointment. Of all the possible forms of an afterlife I'd ever heard of, this one seemed kind of lame. I shivered involuntarily as an episode of The Twilight Zone crawled up from the bowels of my memories. What if that was the point? Torture was a relative concept. Even if I was in pain and suffering, a Renaissance-style Judeo-Christian hellscape would probably still have exciting visuals. It would be more demoralizing to make a sad chimera out of interesting things like the abyss and mundane ones like an office. I rejected that idea and took a deep breath. I wasn't getting anywhere running around in frantic circles in my mind. More than qualified, the hood mumbled just loud enough for me to hear. His words gave me something to focus on. What did I qualify for, sir? I asked. The hood gave a start, dropping the folder as he looked over at me in surprise. I found myself staring at an unrecognizable being. This wasn't a human, devil, or anything really. What I was faced with seemed to be an extension of the abyss itself. I forced myself to blink, feeling I shouldn't look for too long. Well, the hood fumbled as he picked up the folder. It took a few moments to gather its scattered contents. The terms and price should have been explained in your invitation, he said finally. I felt like he was looking at me with curiosity. I couldn't explain why I did, he didn't have facial features, but I still felt it. Just like I couldn't decide exactly how I knew he was a he in the first place. I didn't get any kind of explanation, though I did see an invitation, I replied. I was a little fuzzy on the details of what had happened in my final moments. Yet that message was seared into my mind. You went for it not knowing anything? You're quite the go-getter, the hood said and laughed. It wasn't a happy sound but something like amused resignation. I smiled, or at least forced my mouth into the general shape. It didn't feel like I was smiling, though, which was weird. After working customer service jobs for years, I was an expert at pasting them on. Usually, that was a dead giveaway that I was dreaming. Yet I doubted it this time. Why was a mystery, but the rejection felt instinctive. I was a semi-lucid dreamer. Being conscious during a dream wasn't strange to me. I discreetly moved to pinch myself to prove myself wrong. I wanted this to be a dream, even if I knew it wasn't. You are the winner of a prestigious opportunity to establish a dungeon in service to the forces of chaos, the hooded abyss began. I looked up in surprise, forgetting my little test. With a sweeping gesture, cans of cola manifested on the desk. He pushed one toward me, and I accepted. I wasn't thirsty per se, but I felt comforted by having something familiar to do. As its core, you'll have the freedom to design it according to your taste. Complete creative control, the hood continued. It sounded a bit forced, like a prepared speech from an inexperienced salesman. The kind whose magazine subscription you would not be buying. He paused, catching on to my less than enthusiastic mood. Oddly, his shoulders fell, like he was disappointed, but he rallied a moment later. It seemed like I wasn't his first underwhelmed audience. Now, it's a very cushy position. Only it does come with quite a lot of management duties rather than hands-on killing, the hood started again. This time his voice was a little tighter. It reminded me of when I'd had to speak about my work in class as part of public critiques. I sounded like that when I knew it was going badly but couldn't stop. Feeling a little sympathetic, I drank my cola and tried to listen attentively. The soda distracted me for a few moments. I'd thought it was generic cola the first time, but it tasted like cherry vanilla now. It was a flavor I had conflicting feelings about, so I felt sure I'd have noticed it before. Wait, stop. Needless distractions weren't getting me anywhere. I focused, forcing myself to listen properly. If you want to be knee-deep in blood, guts, and glory, we do have a few lesser opportunities. Demon Lord is particularly popular, the hood said. Did you have any questions so far? It asked after a pause. They asked. I mentally corrected myself sternly. The hood wasn't a recognizable life form, but it was a shitty thing to use it. I stopped. That was an assumption on my part. They were obviously sentient. I also knew that pronouns should be the least of my worries. I felt calm. Way too calm. I know this is real, and I'm not panicking. Why is that? I asked finally. If it weren't for the fact that I'd been like this from the start, I might have thought my drink was drugged. Pardon, the hood asked, caught off guard. I don't understand why I'm not freaking out, I clarified unhappily. It wasn't as if I didn't feel anything. It was just that obvious things that should be happening weren't. Like curling into a fetal position and crying in fear. That would be the system suppressing your feelings. Even those who come here aware of what they signed up for need a bit of help to fully adjust. So the system, let's say it helps them remain functional, the hood explained. He held a steady tone, but he looked away and shifted uncomfortably. It was a stark contrast to his demeanor when he tried to sell me on becoming a dungeon or demon lord. In short, it forces you to accept this as real and prevents you from panicking about it, he continued. I took a few sips of my drink as I digested what I'd been told. I was basically under some kind of compulsion or mind control. Realistically, I'd be freaking the fuck out on hearing that, but once again, I didn't. Instead, I recalled the red letters of the invitation. Dread crept through my mind as I really thought about what was going on. Even if I couldn't panic, nothing about this was right. That I could at least recognize that basic wrongness was a little comforting. Do I have the option to not participate? I asked. I put my can down and pushed it away from me. I needed to focus. My mind was still working, and I wasn't totally devoid of emotions, even if a couple weren't responding correctly. I could still make moral decisions, and so should. The hood looked at me but didn't respond. After staring for a moment, he opened the file he'd been reading before and started leafing through it quickly. Not finding what he was looking for, he set it aside and dug in a drawer until he found another. He rushed through its contents only to come to a grinding halt a moment later. He stared at a sheet of paper I couldn't read, then started laughing. So is that a yes? I asked. As I'd learned in customer service, always choose confident words. Particularly when you didn't feel confident. Customers could smell fear. I apologize. This must be very confusing, the hood said in a gentler tone than before. He set the new folder aside and focused on me. You're not wrong, I replied, feeling defensive. I didn't care for coaxing tones. They always preceded someone trying to screw me over. Under normal circumstances, after significant vetting, a candidate receives an invitation that explains the situation. Your case is different, the hood continued. I nodded, readily accepting that much. Your passenger was the candidate, he continued. I felt an electric thrill roll up my spine. It made sense. That guy was clearly a psycho. Getting to be a dungeon probably would have been a wet dream come true for him. However, there's something of a glitch in the invitation system. If it detects that a candidate has encountered a superior foe, it doesn't play favorites. They receive an invitation as well, and the survivor takes the spoils, so to speak, the hood finished. How exactly is that determined? I asked. The system thought I was a superior foe when matched up against my nightmare passenger. I didn't know how to feel about that. Superior made me want to believe I was a better person. Still, I doubted the system was measuring positive qualities. I really didn't want to be the better potential serial killer. Probable outcomes of the scenario. If you exceed 40% for possible victory, the invitation triggers, the hood explained and looked at the folder. He flipped a few pages. You exceeded 60. Many of your victory scenarios end with you beating the shit out of him with the tire iron you kept next to your seat, the hood said and chuckled. I swallowed involuntarily. I couldn't say the thought hadn't crossed my mind. Chapter 3. Circumstantial Unfortunates. The hood left me with my thoughts for a few much-needed minutes. Less to think or plot so much as just absorb. I'd learned a lot, but the basic scenario hadn't changed. Finally, I sighed. Everything circled back to one critical question. Okay, I got a backdoor invitation. Can I decline it now, and if I do, what happens to me? I asked. The hood looked at me sympathetically but shook his head. In the case of a glitched invite, you can only avoid it by escaping or death. Since you've already killed the original candidate, I'm afraid you're out of options, the hood explained. I'd expected him to say as much but still felt sick. From the moment the message appeared on my windshield, I'd felt a persistent dread. This was a rigged game. You'll have to choose a job and be placed. After that, how you choose to proceed is up to you, the hood continued gravely. The latter half of what he said suggested I could get out of doing anything unfortunate, but his tone crushed that idea. So I have to kill people? I asked bluntly. Dungeons and demon lords were not benevolent things. At least not in the kinds of books I read. More importantly, the system wasn't giving me any reason to think it had friendly intentions. Not given who its first choice of candidate was. Or how I was selected, for that matter. Survival of the fittest was not benevolent on any level. The short answer is yes, especially if you want to live more than a few weeks, the hood clarified. Did I want to live? That was a serious question at the moment. Thankfully the hood didn't pressure me for an answer. He let me take my time processing things once again. I didn't understand why he was being this patient but didn't question that part. I felt like that was a gift horse I should just accept. Can I ask some questions before I choose? I asked hesitantly. It was uncomfortable to admit, but I was fond of living enough that I couldn't simply give up. Please, take your time. I'll tell you what I can, the hood replied. I nodded. Even if his actions had an ulterior motive, I appreciated even a facade of kindness now. You said management and dungeon earlier. I got a sim vibe from that, I began carefully. He hadn't mentioned details. Creative control was all fine and good, but I needed to know what I'd actually be doing. Is that the right idea? I'd be designing the layout and filling it with monsters but not fighting personally. I asked, hoping I was right. Exactly, the hood agreed. You'll build it using an interface like a game. It's an extension of the system. The hood paused when he noticed I flinched. I wasn't a big fan of the system at the moment. It will grow in power as you gain points and invest in it. With it, you can control everything within your domain and bend it to your will, he continued. And a demon lord? I asked, not sure where to start with that one. I wasn't holding out hope that it would turn into a dream job somehow. It's based on personal growth and acquisition of territory. You can gain points through slaying enemies, growing your forces, and conquest, the hood explained. It's a heavily social role, but you get to customize your growth, special abilities, and have access to unique bloodline templates, he continued. Templates. That really harkened back to my tabletop RPG days. Even though it had been years since I'd had that kind of time, I remembered the basics. They'd been all but etched into my bones by long weekends spent around a battle mat. It was weird to think that an old hobby might have been priming me for this situation. Was that intentional? This reminds me of the RPGs I used to play, I said as I mulled my new question over. It's very similar by design, the hood agreed. The return on investment isn't good, but we put out a lot of games to indoctrinate your species, he added. I blinked. I'd just been wondering about that and he'd confirmed it casually. Really? I asked because I couldn't help it. The majority of candidates don't play. The ones who do seem to only understand FPS or dating sims, the hood said, sounding tired. Most of them can do the job anyway, but they tend to have strange expectations, he added with a note of distaste. They want all the waifus. I asked, making the hood flinch. I'd hit a nerve. I had nothing against gamers of any kind, but all hobbies had their unfortunate practitioners. Those kinds of games also had a rep for attracting a particular breed of awful. A shiver rolled down my spine as I imagined my former passenger demanding Excalibur in a lowly harem. That vomit-inducing thought made me feel a little sympathetic toward the hood once again. I knew that was a mistake on a fundamental level. Yet, I couldn't deny an instinctive camaraderie as one who'd worked my share of shitty customer service jobs. Is it going to be a sword and sorcery situation no matter what I pick? I asked. I couldn't shake the RPG vibe I was getting. A high-tech dungeon with an AI controller was valid too, but I felt like that wouldn't be the case. More so for a demon lord. To be fair, you could fudge that by attaching a sound-alike species name in a space opera. All of our current placements are, so yes, the hood agreed. Okay, are there any specific drawbacks I should be aware of before choosing? I asked. Both dungeons and demon lords have to acquire points before the end of the first calendar year after placement. If you fail, you'll be penalized, but that's not my department, so I don't know how, the hood said, sounding a little uncomfortable. I wouldn't assume it's a painless death, though. The system isn't particularly kind to those who don't like to play along, he added. I nodded, not needing to be convinced. So, would I be dropped in during the first month? I asked. It was a graceless pivot, but something the hood said nagged at me. Calendar year meant the win mattered a great deal. The hood smiled despite not having a face. I still wasn't used to feeling an expression and shivered. Not many catch that. the hood said as he looked away. He turned to type something into what looked like a steampunk laptop. I looked at it with envy, admiring the brass and cogs. So. I started but didn't know what to say. The hood kept working for a few minutes, then looked back to me finally. I apologize. It's determined randomly after you pick a job, the hood explained. Will you tell me once I do? I countered. Yes, the hood said after a pause. I nodded and tried to come up with what to ask next. It should have been easy. There were a lot more questions that I should ask. Instead, I sat quietly, rolling the cool can of soda in between my hands. Are you all right? The hood asked after a while. Still trying to get my head around working for the forces of evil, I said after a long pause. The hood didn't say anything at first, his hands tapping out an odd broken rhythm on his desk. You're being tasked to do evil things, but I don't represent evil, nor am I doing placements for them, the hood said finally. Hey! I made a questioning sound as my brain short-circuited. I understood that he was drawing a line. I just didn't get why it mattered. Just. Did you have another question? The hood asked, then sighed. I should have, and a few came to mind, but I let them die unspoken. It was probably the suppression at work, but I had an inexplicable feeling that I'd found out as much as I'd be allowed to know at this moment. That was enough to stop me from asking about things I wanted to know. The rest I was ignoring because I simply didn't want the answers to them. They were things like how the sides were balanced and what would happen if one won. It wouldn't do anything to make me less responsible later, but I desired the bliss of ignorance on the point. I took a sip of soda while I sorted out my future plans. The soda that had been cherry vanilla and now tasted like an orange one somehow. I looked from the beverage to the hood questioningly. Oh, I microbrew as a hobby. A little bit of chaos in a can, he said, tone brighter than before. I guess he took pride in his creation. I looked back down at the can with a conflicted gaze, but not for long. I'd already drunk half of it and was about to formally join the forces of chaos. I might as well just enjoy my lemon-lime soda while I could. All right, I've decided that I'll be a dungeon, I said, and then finished the strawberry soda in one go. The situation wasn't one I'd asked for or become a part of willingly, but that didn't matter. All I could do was make a choice. After that, it would be up to me to make the best of it. All right, I'll get a Demon Lord placement. The hood stopped, head whipping back toward me. You want to be a dungeon? He asked. Yeah. I replied. I wasn't bothered by his question but surprised by his tone. He sounded like a kid who was worried you were teasing him. That you'd snatch back the candy you'd just offered. It suits me better than Demon Lord, at least, I added. I couldn't be sure about other aspects, but I knew that I didn't want to kill things the old-fashioned way. Excellent. You have style and smarts, the hood cried happily as he stood and thrust his hand toward me. I took his hand out of conditioned reflex and instantly regretted it. As my hand touched his, there was an electric pulse that filled my head with static. It was like an old bunny ear antenna TV caught between channels. The crackling hum was laced with an incomprehensible cacophony of voices. Nausea overtook me as my vision swam, but the hood didn't look affected. He carried on and shook my hand so hard the force of it traveled through my entire being. My vision smeared as the static crescendoed to a deafening roar. Chapter 4. Heavenly Body. Rising from the earth for 5 stories, the Heavens Tower was the tallest structure in all of the city of Lithos. Within the blue-gray stone of its walls was a pleasantly buzzing hive of astronomers and omen readers. Yet as the sun was still high, few eyes were turned toward the heavens. Marcus, the apprentice and personal assistant to the great record keeper, was one of the few. It wasn't required that anyone sit atop the tower during daylight, but he liked to at least look like he was busy. Laying listlessly on a bench with a book open on his stomach, he contemplated his future. It was an uncommon line of thought for those residing in Heaven's Tower. As the recorders of the sky and its omens, they were usually concerned with others' futures rather than their own. Most of them didn't know where the great record keeper hid his flask or how much dust was on the record book. The idea of working diligently for decades to wither into a spirit-soaked husk did not suit his personal ambitions. Rubbing his eyes in frustration, he removed his hands just in time to spot something strange. It was a pale but visible streak of green light descending from the heavens. Sitting up, Marcus immediately checked its direction. Once he confirmed it, he ran down the stairs to report the matter. The light had persisted too long to be a minor event, and no comets were due for 100 years. Master! There was an omen. Marcus shouted with the last of his breath as he reached his master's office. Jolted awake, Corin looked at his apprentice with irritated confusion. What? He demanded, not having heard the boy properly. I saw an omen. Marcus reiterated. Corin looked at the boy suspiciously but got up to check the seeing pool. It was a large solid stone half-sphere with lines of latitude and longitude carved into it. As he looked inside, an illusion of the sky appeared. He rolled back the record a few minutes with a gesture until the green streak of light was revealed. It disappeared from the range of the seeing pool's recording but looked intact. It's nothing, Corin said grumpily, dismissing the illusion completely. Master, it's a weak omen but an omen nonetheless, Marcus insisted with the last of his courage. No matter how experienced his teacher was, they had a clearly defined duty. Neglecting it, even in trivial issues, would only bring them trouble. Leave it be, Corin said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Go wash the tower steps to help clear your mind, Corin added. Marcus looked at him with hurt in his muddy brown eyes but did as he was told. Watching the boy go, Corin felt a moment of guilt, but it passed. He'd be retiring soon and had no interest in being dragged into the brouhaha a new prophecy would stir up. That was the province of younger men who still thought they could change things. The best he could do was change his state of sobriety when he finally found his flask. The damned thing seemed to have a mind of its own. It always managed to be in a different spot than he remembered leaving it in. When it finally turned up, it was on top of the pile of correspondence he'd been neglecting. Corin felt his guts constrict. He wouldn't have left it there. Marcus must have found it. The boy must have been the one moving it the entire time. Fucking brat! Corin muttered, throwing the flask across his office. It was pointless, but he couldn't shake the look of disappointment he'd seen. It wasn't the first time the boy had looked at him like that. Getting out a ledger dusty with disuse, Corin began the process of documenting the omen. As he worked through the calculations, his heart fell, but he kept working. If it came down to it, he could retire early, but it was past time he stopped dishonoring the office. On the 6th day of Eliran, record keeper Corin of Lithos. A green falling star began atmospheric descent at noon. Observer, apprentice Marcus, confirmed via seeing stone. Estimated point of impact, the coral sands of the Malthus Desert. The nearest landmark, Laurel Mountains. Not within a currently recognized country. Nearest nations, Kingdom of Dridmar and Kingdom of Stromholt. Falls within borders of the historic nation of Isold, commonly known as the Mage Kingdom. Meaning undetermined. As Corin did his job for the first time in months and Marcus prepared to scrub steps, the green light continued its path, passing over land and sea as its arc continued to decay. Few noticed the pale light in the bright sky. It wasn't until it passed over a column of soldiers that it caught the attention of a pair of blue eyes. Elim. Sergeant Carver asked the young man. He'd approached with a purposeful look only to be distracted by something above. Is that a shooting star? Elim asked in confusion. He'd seen a few at night, but they were minor things and gone in a blink. This one looked different to him, but he couldn't think of anything else to call it. Could be a comet. Sergeant Carver offered after looking up. It was a strange sight in a daylit sky, but he didn't think much of it. He knew a little more about astronomy than most, but not enough to identify whatever they were looking at. What did you come over for? Or was that it? He asked once he lost interest in the streak of light. No, sir, Sergeant. I came because I think we're on the wrong road, Aleem explained. He gave a surreptitious glance toward the higher-ranking officers a few yards away. Carver did on reflex as well. Neither one of them was inclined to get near Captain Yonig if they weren't called on first. At least not if it wasn't an emergency. Why's that? Captain Yonig called, diverting his horse over to their side. Both men were startled by how good his hearing was, but didn't say anything. He would have heard it eventually. They just would have preferred to pass it up the chain than report directly. I'm on point, sir. The roads have been getting narrow, and the trees aren't cut back properly, Aleem explained. Captain Yonig nodded, then turned to leave without saying anything further. After discussing the matter with the other officers, a break was called. It wasn't long before scouts were sent out. They returned quickly, confirming Aleem's suspicion about the road. The soldiers took it in stride. It wasn't unusual to end up on the wrong route once or twice in the hinterlands. Most were relieved to find out they weren't so off course that the trip would be longer. The column resumed its travel, but not before a hawk with a message arrived. A search and destroy order for a band of bandits with a longbowman had come. A collective groan was shared by the soldiers on point. It would likely fall to them to carry it out if the targets were discovered along the way. They were accustomed to dealing with the trouble they found along the way. A search and destroy order was a different matter altogether. It meant they had to pursue the targets if encountered. I hope we do cross those bandits, I'm bored too, Cal, one of the youngest on point, whined, only to be cut off by a punch in the guts. Anders, who'd punched him, and no shortage of others, spat to ward off the unlucky words. What? Cal demanded, almost breathless from the blow. Anders wasn't a light touch when it came to matters of luck. If you jinxed us, I'll punch you in the dick, Aleem offered by way of explanation. Cal wasn't new, but this was his first time assigned outside of a fortress's relative safety. He was excited to do something other than walk along a wall. Everyone else just wanted to get home in one piece. Oh come on, what's Cal started but stopped as Anders held up his fist as a warning. Not another fucking word, understood? Anders growled. Whether he did or not, Cal nodded. As if some malevolent force had been waiting for an invitation, a horse was heard approaching. Sergeant Carver was riding over with a grim expression. In tow was a soldier on a lighter horse wearing the insignia of the Scouts. Seeing the pair, the soldiers on point felt a creeping dread. A scout wouldn't be needed if the chance of actually coming across the bandits was low. Assigning one was as good as saying the encounter was expected. Since the paths are going to turn narrow, we're going to have to lengthen the column. We'll regroup in some farm fields ahead before course correcting. You lot get to secure the site, Sergeant Carver explained. It was unwelcome but not unexpected news. Cal got some hard looks, but no one moved to hit him again. Not even once Sergeant Carver left. Doing as they were told, the unit accepted Tiller into their ranks without comment. It was half an hour before the road narrowed to the point where only 2 horsemen could advance at a time. The column had already reorganized in anticipation, but it still slowed things. The point team came out of the forest to a cleared field an hour later. It belonged to a modest farm cut into the land and wasn't far from the farmyard itself. With enough space to rally, the only thing left to do was set up a perimeter and wait for the rest of the column to join them. You have to be fucking joking, Anders swore as something caught his attention in the distance. Aleem looked over and noticed a flurry of activity in the farmyard. It was a little far to make out details but too disorganized to be regular work. Farmers didn't stuff chickens in sacks. Do any of them? Aleem started only to fall silent as a pale streak shot through the air. One of the bandits had taken offense at a circling Black Hawk and fired at it. Fuck! Went up a collective roar of misery. The bandits had condemned themselves and the soldiers to an unavoidable confrontation. This is complete bullshit, Anders complained as he glared daggers at the farm. Bullshit, that spotted us, Elim observed. For a brief moment, the farm had gone still as someone spotted them, only then to boil once more with activity. They were running for it. Tiller takes the lead. You lot, follow him and get to it, Sergeant Carver ordered. He'd arrived along with men to replace them in securing the rally site, which left them no reason to dawdle. Tiller set off immediately, and the rest followed him. Elim fell in immediately but was glancing at the sky. He was the only one of the group to notice they seemed to be following the path the light in the sky had traced earlier. He considered mentioning it to the others but thought better of it. They had their orders and couldn't disobey. The only thing he'd get for his troubles was a punch from Anders. Elim could live without that. Chapter 5. Schrodinger's Trolley. When my senses cleared, I was sitting in a comfy chair at the foot of a mountain range. Before me stretched what seemed like an endless desert punctuated by wind-sculpted stone. Above that sea of sand, 3 moons glowed. I stared up at the sight, uncertain of how to feel. The joke in sci-fi movies was to show 2 suns in the sky to make any random stretch of desert an alien world. What I was looking at wasn't a cheap image edit. They were celestial bodies with distinct appearances. The largest moon was a familiar silvery blue-gray but smooth and full. Smaller and seemingly further away was the more pitted yellow one showing half its face. The last one was a washed-out pink crescent. I didn't know what to make of the moons being in different phases. That I was more confused by that than the fact there were 3 was selective attention at its finest. All I knew for sure was that it was a gorgeous view, in a lonely way. I didn't have the heart to appreciate it. I'd just remembered, there was a question I'd forgotten about. Who was the 3rd person I killed? I asked aloud to the sand and stones around me. The first thing I'd heard the hood say was my praise for my kill count, which was 3 people. It didn't make sense. People had been nearby, but I hadn't hit anyone when I crashed. Eric Rashad, age 75. He died of a heart attack when your car stopped only inches from him, the hood whispered in my ear. It sent a not entirely unpleasant shiver down my spine. A base thrill that did nothing to stop me from looking for the source in a panic. You received a bonus since he didn't have a history of heart disease, he continued. I looked around but found I was utterly alone still. Thanks, I said, nodding as I tried not to shit in my comfy chair. If the voice was purely in my head, that would have been one thing. Instead, it had felt like he was leaning down above my shoulder. That added touch of the physical had been unnerving in the extreme. You're welcome. In keeping with my promise, you were assigned 2 weeks until the year's end, the hood explained. In the corner of my vision, a countdown appeared. I enjoyed our chat. Text me anytime if you have a question. Or just want to talk, the hood added cheerfully in my mind before hanging up with an audible click. I scrubbed my face with my hands and let out a groan of frustrated misery. I didn't bother moving from where I'd been placed for an hour. I'd accepted that I killed my passenger already. That guy could go fuck himself with a knife. Knowing I was responsible for another death was different. Eric Rashad was an absolute stranger. I knew nothing about him and hadn't meant him any harm. Yet, he'd still died because of my actions. I sighed and scrubbed my face with my hands again but didn't feel much. I didn't worry about the lack of sensation. I had to be in some form of shock. Running the situation through my head on repeat, it played out like a reverse of the trolley problem. I'd chosen to try to save multiple lives, and it had cost a stranger his. Now that I couldn't change anything, did I feel like a monster? The short answer was no. Even if I'd seen Eric, I'd still have done it. At least going by the description. I hadn't hit him but scared him to death. It was shitty, but I couldn't have predicted that. Another question posed wasn't as easy to answer. Would I have done the same thing if it did require hitting someone? Ultimately I wasn't sure. It felt like I could if needed, but I doubted I'd make the decision in time. Swerving into a pole was a more straightforward bit of ethical math than hitting someone. It occurred to me it was odd that I was thinking about it in such depth. I was rational. That wasn't likely a likely turn of events, not if my mind were normal. I was contemplating the fact I'd committed manslaughter, not comparing paint colors. The system's suppression still had to be in effect. I started to swear but stopped short. What the fuck? I said, shocked by my voice. I'd been too surprised by the hood answering me before to register it. Now I had the distinct displeasure of hearing it. It was an inhuman whisper of opposing ranges. Not a single voice, but as if two women were speaking in sync. Do re mi fa. I started to sing only to stop. The sound of my attempt at singing weirding me out too much. I made a secondary discovery when I brought my hand up to touch my mouth. I thought I was looking at an outline for a moment, but then realized that couldn't be true. My surroundings were washed out in color but clear. My hand was a shadowy black that turned almost transparent at the edges. Looking down at the rest of my body, I only found more surprises. My entire form looked as if it were made of shadow, and my anatomy had changed. This wasn't right. I shouldn't look like this. Humans didn't look like this. It was an uncomfortable revelation, but I didn't dwell on it for long. I continued the inspection of my new form. I had a cartoon genie-style tail instead of legs. My body also looked flat, but I still found curves and contours when I ran my hands over it. The inspection continued as I tried to determine what the parts I couldn't easily see had become. I ran my hands with their long willowy fingers through my hair. I didn't feel anything at first and questioned if I had any. A moment later, a few smoky tendrils floated into my vision. Playing with them, I found they acted as a single smooth mass. Like mist, sections of it would divide when I pulled my fingers through only to reform. It was weird to watch and reinforced that whatever I was now, it wasn't human. Open interface, I said aloud. I needed information, and I wouldn't get it by sitting and spinning in a chair all night. A window opened, and I was faced with 5 tabs, the first of which was unlabeled. The rest, in order, were inventory, dungeon map, monsters, and a store. The unlabeled tab contained my personal information, including a picture of all things. I stared at it, surprised to find it showed small green orbs of flame where eyes should be. I felt like I could see myself in that bit of darkness, though how eluded me. Wanting something more concrete, I looked at my listed species. It was Dungeon Master. I immediately opened the tooltip next to it. An information window that reminded me of a kid's encyclopedia of animals opened. It showed a picture and followed by a description and facts. Dungeon Master. A soul bound to a dungeon core that controls the construction of dungeons. Their existence is sustained by the dungeon core. The description was laughably simple. I glared at it but only half-heartedly. I wanted it to tell me more, but I didn't know what. It also occurred to me that I might not like what I found out if my wish was granted. Under the lackluster description was a chart with the progression of transformation levels. Unlike the preceding section, this one went in depth into its subject. It gave the name, physical description, abilities, and a set of pictures for each level. I glanced past them until I found the one that best described my current state. Dungeon Master, unmodified, matched me perfectly. That meant the transformation was complete. I reached up to touch my face and felt where my eyes should have been. I had brows and what felt like sockets, but they were empty and smooth. Like the cavities in a doll's face where glass eyes would eventually go. Sticking my fingers into one didn't hurt the socket or feel hot despite the image of flames. It also didn't block my vision, which was bizarre in its own right. At a guess, the fire might have been symbolic rather than how I actually perceived things. That or bits of it got around my fingers and was enough for uninterrupted vision. Despite what the picture showed, there was no sense of heat. My fingers passed through where the flames should have been without resistance. That I was jabbing myself in the eye and rummaging around in the socket finally sunk in. I stopped. The thought of it weirded me out despite there being no pain. That was when an odd thought occurred to me. How had I looked before? That realization struck me like an avalanche and buried every other thought process. I'd assumed on a certain level that I'd change when the deal was struck. I could accept that much and the drastic change to my appearance. What was stalling every other function of my brain was how I couldn't recall how I'd looked before the transformation. National origin, skin color, hair length, everything about myself was a blank. I tried to remember anything about myself, no matter how trivial. The more I tried, the more I realized was missing. Pizza toppings, famous people, the Macarena, all of that was intact. It was my personal information that was gone. I had no idea where or how I lived or if I had any family. I was missing. Chapter 6. Identity pending. The loss of my personal information hit me harder than my body's transformation. Becoming something other than human was alarming but felt less invasive. Even if I didn't look the same, it was still me. Not knowing even the most basic of things about myself was different. It touched on a more fundamental fear. The body was a vessel. The mind was the self. So who was I now? I didn't have a ready answer. The extent of my personal memories began with the events leading to my death. Or at least a fuzzy version of them. I knew exactly what happened and how I felt but couldn't recall anything about myself. Not even what, if anything, I'd had for breakfast that day. That impersonal personal experience continued to the present moment. That was less than a day's worth. As I came to fully understand my situation, I felt something start to rise up in me. The feeling of building pressure lasted for several moments before subsiding like a wave failing to crest. I sat in the calm aftermath and wondered if what I'd felt was a nervous breakdown being averted. My feelings about the suppression function went from bitter mistrust to almost gratitude. I did truly hate the idea of having my feelings controlled. That didn't mean I would trade unnatural calm for a mental breakdown. I wasn't a masochist, and dysphoria was not a joke. It didn't take me long to start to wonder why so much of me was missing. Wanting answers, I reopened the interface and returned to the Dungeon Master information. I started actually reading the full progression chart this time. The pictures, in particular, were fascinating. The first level was Demi-Dungeon Master. It was no longer a member of its base species but retained around 90% of the appearance. Most of the difference was internal. The visual examples showed the different ways it might manifest. The body's systems were infected or replaced, resulting in black blood. Slight elongation of the limbs and fingers might occur, but it wasn't guaranteed. The more severe visual changes began at the next level. Looking away from the chart, I studied one of my hands. The number of joints was human standard. It was the proportion when compared with the palm that showed they were longer than they should be. They also had stiletto tip style nails. They were sharp but not long or excessively thick, which kept them from looking like claws. I gave a desultory chuckle with my new weird voice. It seemed like the system had given me a fashionable manicure. I shuddered as I looked at the chart. I'd gone from human to full dungeon master without experiencing the intermediate stages. I hadn't had any problem reading about it, but now I felt a particular horror. Living through the process of corruption must be terrifying. It was one thing to know something would happen. It was another to actually experience it. Even if you walked into the deal willingly and aware. That didn't make me feel much sympathy for those who accepted the system's invitation. It more of a second-hand revulsion. The experience had to be nightmarish. Moving past the chart, I started skimming the facts section. The entries were brief and to the point, but I soon found some of the content was incomprehensible. The letters were ones I understood, but they didn't form words I recognized or could figure out by context. The name of what my flesh was made of was an excellent example. It was 14 letters long, started with AZ, and was totally unpronounceable. I abbreviated it to Z14 in my head. I needed to commit everything to memory eventually, but none of it answered my question. There was no mention of memory or identity loss anywhere in the entry. Trying to work it out myself, two theories jumped at me. Firstly, it was a result of the transformation but not listed. The second option I came up with was more unnerving. That my current amnesiac state was a result of the system's suppression function. I shivered at the thought of the latter. The hood hadn't described its function in detail. I could only go off his description of making candidates functional. The idea that I needed this much of myself censored to hit that baseline was unnerving. I didn't know why it had happened or how long it would last. I might be like this until I adjusted on some level psychologically. Or for the rest of my new unnatural existence. Thinking about that, there was only one thing I could do. No matter how little control I had, it was up to me to decide how to respond to my current circumstances. Who I'd been before was gone was no more. Whether it was because of the system's suppression, my identity being corroded away by the transformation, or something else didn't matter. I, as I currently existed, was all there was. A newborn dungeon master. One who needed to decide what that meant to them. It took me an hour and some meditative spinning in my chair to realize I had no idea what it meant to me. Everything about my situation was terrifyingly new. In the end, I accepted my lack of coherent thoughts on the subject as an answer of sorts. It was half-assed but the best I could do. I needed time. Thinking of time, I looked at the countdown and arched an eyebrow in surprise. The hood had said I was assigned 2 weeks, but it was counting down 3. That might have been an error, but I didn't think so. Not with how he'd suddenly started working on his computer earlier when I asked. I couldn't help but laugh at myself. I thought well of the abyss that had placed me in my current predicament. It was sad in a funny way if you looked at it from a certain angle. Everything was terrible, but I was still alive, and I wanted to stay that way. With my mind as made up as it was going to be, it was time to stop ruminating. Not everything could be understood by thinking. It was time to start doing. Feeling overwhelmed, I tilted back as far as possible in the chair. Further actually as it tipped and fell back. Landing in the sand, I didn't bother getting up and looked into the sky above me instead. I'd noticed the moons right off but hadn't looked at the stars. Now I was treated to an inky vault that glittered brilliantly. This world, or at least this region, didn't have much light pollution. Without that interference, the longer I gazed, the more was revealed of the strange heavens above me. It was as breathtaking as it was unfamiliar. No band of the Milky Way cut through it nor familiar constellations. Just indifferent beauty as the night continued on its course. Turning my eyes away, I looked at the desert landscape beneath them. It should have been challenging to see anything but silhouettes even by the light of the moons above. Yet I found I had no such trouble. The land was bathed in silvery blue, but my night vision was perfect aside from that color shift. I could have started exploring but felt apathetic toward the idea. I didn't know much about what I was supposed to do or how. It felt like a bad idea to proceed without at least trying to know a bit more. I played back my conversation with the hood in my head. He'd said the system was game-like. That gave me an idea. Manual? Tutorial? I said aloud, wanting to get used to the sound of my voice. I didn't expect anything so convenient to appear, but they did as a pair of pop-ups. I could begin reading or start the tutorial. Thinking about what I knew about video games, it was better to do the tutorial first. Manuals were practical but might not cover the basics. I'd be better off using it for reference once I understood how things worked. I closed the manual and selected Start for the tutorial. The desert around me shimmered like a heat haze and vanished. Chapter 7. Xmontage.mp4 not found. I found myself in a tunnel, surrounded by uncomfortably warm lava and the pungent odor of sulfur. Since I felt it so strongly, it must have been at least at boiling blood levels of heat. My body didn't feel much of anything, after all. A sign in a cheerful palm tree-themed font informed me I had arrived at the labyrinth of lava. A sign taped to the first sign added, under construction. I was starting to feel like I'd be getting my intro from a talking fruity umbrella drink. Hi. I'm Agony. I'll be your guide for this tutorial, a cheerful voice said suddenly. I jumped in surprise. A small humanoid, made of lava, hovered in front of me. Its face and body were a combination of black stone, glowing fiery heat, and adorable. I dubbed him a lava sprite in my head but didn't say it aloud. I'm still working on a name. It's a pleasure to meet you, Agony, I said. I'd forgotten about my lack of a name. I could have called myself anything from Barbie to Janice, and it would have been fine. Only it wouldn't have been sufficient for me. It didn't feel right to pick something mundane. I wanted my new name to sound badass. Actually badass. Not edgelordish like Mistress Nightshade or some other vampire romance OC name. No problem. Would you like to start the tutorial or skip it? Agony asked, his smile seeming strained. I'd like to start, please, I said, confused by the option to skip. I'd had to start it, so it didn't make sense to skip. Really? You'll still get the basic items if you skip, Agony said with narrowed eyes. It was like he thought I was teasing him. I want to learn how to do this right, I explained, projecting confidence. It was something I was good at despite not feeling much of it. If most people skipped, then Agony probably didn't get many chances to teach. I might be in for a rough ride. We're going to get along, Agony said after a slight pause. A glowing smile cracking the blackened stone of his face. Follow me. He shouted and started flying down the lava tube. He brought me to what he called the core room of the prefab dungeon. Once we were in, he started the tutorial with a cheerful burst of video game music. The similarity to sim and tower defense games was intense. A fact that made things easy to follow, even when Agony went too fast, which was most of the time. He zipped around like a kid showing off his treasures to a new friend. I floated after him as quickly as I could, happy to be the friend. You can buy terrain tiles in your shop. Buy 4 of whatever you like to hit the goal, then I'll show you a trick, Agony said happily. Hovering in a bouncy way as he waited for me to comply. I did as he said and started examining tiles. Most had small flame icons in the upper right corner. That indicated they created a heat hazard of varying degrees of severity. Looking at the tooltip, a chart appeared. It indicated how severe a status ailment it caused versus levels of elemental protection. That was definitely something I needed to keep in mind. Wanting to keep this purchase simple, I looked at the layout then bought 4 tunnel tiles. They were squares measuring 40 feet on a side. I cringed a little, not seeing an elegant way to arrange them. Once I was done, a burst of sparkles went off with a text scrawl, letting me know I'd hit my goal. Okay, now go into your map and select grid view, Agony said. I tried to comply but couldn't find what I was looking for. I was in the map view, but nothing said grid or gave any indication that it was a feature. I can't find it, I admitted after looking a few times. There weren't any icons or buttons, nothing to give me a clue why I didn't see what I was supposed to be. Oh, try thinking view options instead. You might be in light mode, Agony said, and I tilted my head in confusion. The interface had settings. I'd never considered that, despite its similarities to a game interface. It made sense to me after some thought. Nothing happened at first, but I didn't give up. I cycled through alternatives, all the while my focus growing in frustrated intensity. It was something that was supposed to be there. I wasn't going to tuck my tail between. I wasn't going to curl up in a ball in defeat. My new anatomy really didn't mesh with some human standard colloquialisms. Doubling down on my focus after that distraction, I felt a painful popping sensation. Like how ears would sometimes hurt after a severe altitude change. It was sudden and sharp, causing my vision to go fuzzy but gone in a single burst. You okay? Agony asked. Yeah. I think so. I just felt something weird and painful for a second there, I answered honestly. I don't know much about DM anatomy. How do you feel now? Agony asked, flying around my shoulders to study me in concern. Fine. More weirded out than anything, I explained as I did a quick inventory of myself. Nothing felt different, though I couldn't say that was normal either. At least not yet, my body worked fine, but I still needed to adjust. Oh, but the map options showed up finally, I said as I noticed them. An expanded menu offering different viewing options awaited me. I'd have to go through them all later, but I checked the grid for the moment. An overlay appeared, slicing the dungeon and the surrounding area into neat squares. Only they weren't 40x40 chunks like I'd bought in the store. Depending on what I chose, they went as small as 1 foot. The areas I owned also highlight red if I zoomed out past a certain point. You sure you're okay to continue? Agony asked. May as well since neither of us know what that was, I said and shrugged. Finding out I'd lost my name and the related identity had been overwhelming. So much so that I'd felt like I was on the verge of something awful. That it petered out anticlimactically had to be the suppression function at work. This time I felt the incident was mildly worrying. It was a turn of events that I found almost comforting. It seemed like not all my negative emotions would be subject to censure. Though they weren't convenient, they were still a part of me. Pick a square from outside the dungeon. A monoglyph with the cost under it should appear. You can buy it for that price. It's also added to your store, Agony said. He was going along with my wishes though he still looked concerned. I nodded as I followed his instructions. I appreciated him respecting my choice. I knew too little about myself to think ruminating on what happened would give me a revelation. It was easier to keep going, so I selected a section like he'd told me to. An uneven patch of hexagonal basalt pillars appeared in a corner when I dropped in my new tile. Since it was still selected, I rotated it a few times until I liked the aesthetic before deselecting it. They looked like broken steps connecting the lava tube to the core room. Can I edit them on a smaller scale or only as the 40 by 40 I bought them as? I asked. It was good to get large patches for a low price but harder to develop a good layout. You can't move a section smaller than 1 by 1, but you can edit features on any scale. Try playing around with the basalt a bit, Agony suggested. I didn't need much encouragement to get artistic and got to work. So how do I stopped as I looked at a pillar, and it highlighted. I couldn't twist it or anything drastic, but I could raise and lower its height and increase its width. The other parts of the formation reacted elastically to accommodate the change. It was trippy to watch but fun. Oh Felicity, I said happily and laughed. The words took a second to sink in. That was not what I'd meant to say. Auto-filter on the tutorial. I have a potty mouth. According to the customer experience surveys anyway, Agony explained. I hadn't even got the question out yet. Really? I asked, taken aback by the idea. The system had an active profanity filter and customer experience surveys. I wasn't sure which thing was more bizarre between the two. Really, Agony said gloomily, but let's move on. Play with the tiles a bit more. I nodded and started earnestly trying to make the basalt look imposing. It was already an improvement over the simple slope it had replaced, but I knew I could do better. Like jagged teeth around a maw at the entrance, I varied the heights and angles. Before, an average person would have been able to use it without difficulty. Now it looked sinister and inconvenient. Finished and feeling happy with the design, I looked to Agony, hoping for approval. Nice, Agony said with a smile. I felt relieved as he offered me a fiery fist bump. I accepted with a shadowy knuckle. I felt an urge to spruce up the design of the entire dungeon but had to stop myself. I had 1,000 mana to play with, which seemed like a lot. The trouble was that after doing some mental math, I realized that making my dungeon too big was a trap. The larger the floor plan was, the more difficult it would be to populate. It wasn't a bad idea to use exhaustion to soften someone up, but it was a delicate balance. Especially since I could only afford so many monsters and traps. Too much space meant dead spots where they could take time to recover. I needed to try and balance challenge density against size. A problem that was complicated not only by cost but by the placement restrictions. A light repeating crossbow trap could be tossed in anywhere. A hallway-style dart trap wasn't as straightforward. The sections had to be continuous or have 5 feet of clearance between them. Other traps couldn't be within a specific range of other hazards. Monsters likewise could have complex needs. They varied from room size to the minimum population of a subordinate species. They weren't easy to predict either. Fire rats, a trash tier monster, needed 15 minor rats to have a rat boss. It was an intricate process to address all the prerequisites. Still, I enjoyed the puzzle rather than crumbling under pressure. I knocked out several of my objectives while I contemplated how best to keep myself safe. Lost in thought, I bounced several feet into the air when a siren wailed. It was loud enough to burst eardrums, and a red light strobed with each screech. Red alert was my first thought. Why? I asked Agony as I blocked my ears. Unfortunately, I didn't sense anything with them. Jamming my shadowy fingers in them didn't lessen the sound. Mute alarm! Agony shouted at me, his little hands over his stone ears. The siren drowned at his words, but I read his lips and gave the command. The sound went away, although the strobe effect continued. Order and tax law! Agony growled. I gave a start but found it cute after that moment of surprise. That fact I decided to keep to myself, as he looked pissed enough already. Put your map in share mode. Agony said after a few minutes of tapping his ears and adorable cursing. I thought the command and an icon of a person with a plus sign next to it appeared. Light mode sucked ass. I took Agony's advice and thought standard mode to change it over. Nothing happened. Either I'd revealed everything hidden or wasn't thinking of the correct thing. It was something to figure out once whatever had set the alarm off was dealt with. With the map visible to both of us, I spotted a cluster of red-tinted tiles. They were flashing, but I didn't understand what the problem was. Agony changed the map view, and a 3D model appeared. The problem was a lava flow I'd placed into part of the labyrinth to break up the monotonous stone corridors. Okay, so rule, something or other. This is a game. It has to be possible for heroes with luck, pluck, and nothing left to lose to make it through, Agony explained. He tapped a lava tile, and a tooltip was revealed. Inside the tip window were more detailed statistics. This stuff is too hot to get past even with maxed out fire resistance. You can still use it, but the placement made the labyrinth impassable. That triggered the obstruction alarm, Agony said. He pointed out in the expanded description the tile was a barrier type. It was impassable even with maxed out fire resistance. I nodded along with the explanation. After getting to know the rules for monsters and traps, I wasn't that surprised. It was weird that the terrain conditions weren't labeled more clearly. On the bright side, it wasn't as much of a problem now that I was aware of it. So long as it's in any kind of build alarm state, heroes can't enter. Worse, you have to act fast. If you don't address it before the timer runs out, there's a penalty. Also, any people inside will be ejected without harm, Agony added. He pointed to what I'd mistaken for a regular clock in the corner of the map screen. Noted, I said, wide-eyed and eager to never experience that again. I added figuring out how to block my hearing to the growing list of things I needed to figure out how to do. It was right below figuring out how to experience a higher level of touch sensitivity. It's all right. Better it happened now than when you're on your own, Agony said, and I nodded in complete agreement. Seems like a good trick to use if a party is too strong, I commented. Oh, no, you do not want to do that, Agony said quickly. Why? I asked. Agony looked at me with a sad smile, then grimaced. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Are you okay? I asked, uncertain of what was happening to him. I can't comment on content outside of the scope of the tutorial, Agony explained. He looked away from me and crossed his arms like he was pouting. It was adorable, but I felt bad for him. I wasn't exactly fond of how the system censored me either. Thanks for trying, I said, reaching over to pat his head. The tip of my finger felt warm where it touched his hair like flames. Just, make sure you don't do it during a raid. Other times it's fine. Okay. Agony said. It looked like he'd strained himself to say it. I won't, I agreed. I shivered as I recalled that the system didn't take kindly to those who didn't play along. The hood had warned me about that, and I could see this counting as poor sportsmanship. Okay, finish up the rest of your goals. We'll get started on the second half, Agony continued. I nodded and got down to business. The goals were all interface-oriented. Nothing I learned was revelatory. The real value of it was Agony's help rather than the tutorial content itself. Despite my initial misgivings, Agony was a good teacher. Without him, it would have taken hours to sort out my various fuck UPS and the vaguely worded goals. Agony was patient and kept his sense of humor even when explaining something for the third time. The only thing he wouldn't help with was strategic advice. I felt like that should have been within the scope of the tutorial. Thinking about it, I remembered that the hood had said I'd have complete creative control. Strategy tips shouldn't have been a violation, but it was the only reason that jumped to mind. That and the system being a bag of dicks for no reason. That was also possible, but I hoped not. I filed the tutorial issue under things that seemed strange. A list that was growing by the minute and unlikely to stop. I could have asked Agony about it but felt reluctant. The question seemed like something outside the scope of the tutorial. He could have declined to answer even if I did, but I felt like he wouldn't. We hadn't known each other long, but he'd been helpful. I'm done, I said finally. I'd been allotted a pool of mana and some starter items to work from. Strictly from a spending perspective, it didn't take me long to use up my resources. What I'd spent the most time on was the creative arrangement. Once I spoke, a prompt appeared, asking me if I wished to continue. I selected yes, and a small clock appeared on the map outside of the dungeon's entrance. A cluster of what looked like fantasy-themed bathroom sign icons was next to the timer. I looked questioningly at Agony, who grinned. No point in making it if you don't test it, Agony explained, then cackled like a cartoon villain. The timer hit 0, and the icons were inside the dungeon. He touched one, and an info box appeared. Closing it, he selected the entire party, and a new option appeared, track. Hey, are they actual people? I asked. This was a tutorial, but I didn't want to make assumptions. I was a dungeon core aligned with chaos standing in a lava dungeon, after all. More familiar logic didn't exactly apply to my situation anymore. I mean, that kind of depends on your definition of actual end people, Agony said before giving a slight shrug. Sapient life forms, I clarified. Oh. Yeah, totally, Agony replied with glee. I was still trying to absorb that information when Agony did something to the map. It changed from an overhead view to high-definition surveillance footage feed. I could see the hero party now instead of abstract tokens. I got to watch in glorious technicolor as they tore through my labyrinth like it was made of paper. Mother of felicities! I was shouting unimaginatively as they murdered their way to the core room and shattered it. Chapter 8. Office Relations. Amidst the towering spires of the arcane nexus, a single figure was running toward a rapidly closing door. The elevator in which Law stood, making no move to stop it even as the desperate figure hurried to catch it. Hey, hold, the neutrality called out. He'd been running hard from the entrance, knowing there was no telling when another elevator would arrive. Neutrality, Law said indifferently just before the doors closed completely. Neutrality looked at the closed door with apathetic rage. There was no formal rule on the subject, so Law could do as they like. It didn't make them less of a bastard in Neutrality's eyes. His only solace was the fact he wouldn't actually have to endure the ride in Law's company. They didn't interact much since Neutrality transferred to a different office to get away from them. He'd almost forgotten what it was like to be trapped with someone who knew every single rule down to the clauses and wouldn't shut up about them. Neutrality shuddered at the memory. He'd been happy once and the subject of envy when he'd not only been promoted to system admin and placed in the same office as Good and Law. It was almost funny to remember now. After 2 weeks, he'd been caught between transferring to preserve his sanity or alcoholism to numb himself. Despite choosing the former, he was still on the fence about the latter. His new office and co-workers were different if not precisely easier to get along with. New. Chaos called from across the elevator lobby. Neutrality turned and found them holding a door open, the entrance to the janitor's closet, to be exact. Chaos, Neutrality called back, managing a smile. Chaos waved him over, and they entered the closet only to step through and into Chaos's cubicle. The cubicle that was 10 floors up from the lobby. Neutrality knew it wasn't good to think too hard about anything involving Chaos and didn't ask how it was possible. He applied the same theory to rummaging in Chaos's mini fridge for snacks. Noticing a case of mystery beverage, he felt like his morning was starting to look up one of Chaos's old colleagues microbrewed it themselves. Taking a can and a fistful of frozen mini burritos, Neutrality felt a bit better. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but it was better than the nothing he'd had after realizing he was going to be late. Feeling generous, he emptied the contents of his pockets into a coffee can labeled currency. He knew Chaos would enjoy whatever random collection of garbage turned up more than money. He still added some of that too, though. It felt too weird not to. On the way to his desk, he glanced over at the communal refrigerator. It would have been nice to keep things in it, but he gave the idea up immediately. Evil used it, and once Evil claimed something as its domain, it was best to just leave it be. Much like the closest bathroom to the office. Reaching his desk, he paused, taking in its ransacked state. Neutrality started only to fall silent. His first impulse was to blame Evil, but he knew better. Without hard evidence, he'd been in for the verbal tongue lashing of the century. Looking through the mess, he couldn't find anything actually missing. It was possible that Chaos had done it. They might have needed a pen and tore the desk apart, looking for a specific one. Ignoring the cup full of them next to the view screen for arcane reasons. Despite knowing better, his eyeline still drifted toward Evil. He was on time, but they were already in the office. Either having shown up early or never leaving in the first place. It was hard to tell which it was. No matter what else he might fault them for, enthusiasm for the job wasn't on the list. They were already diligently marking help tickets as complete and closing. All without looking at the content or glancing just long enough to make sure they were sending the wrong Q&A links for resolutions. Deciding to let the matter go, Neutrality busied himself with cleaning up his desk. Once that was done, he felt a bit better. It was time to get to work. "Hey, New, got a minute?" Evil asked, head peeking above the office dividers between them. They all had names, but none of them bothered to share. It was easier to address each other by alignment faction. "Is there something I can help with, Evil?" Neutrality asked, though he'd have preferred to immediately refuse. Evil wasn't the type to care about rejection. They only concerned themselves with getting what they wanted. On the flip side, they would definitely remember any refusal or interference. No one said anything, but it was an open secret that Neutrality's job had opened up after the prior admin had crossed Evil. Chaos had mentioned it once while glancing around fearfully. Something about a potluck sign-up gone awry. Even without that, it was better to approach them with a bargaining mindset to Neutrality's way of thinking. He didn't enjoy accumulating needless grudges. That was more Law's domain in his experience. "Funny you should ask," Evil replied and laughed. Neutrality didn't join in on the false mirth, and it didn't last long. "So, there are some features that have to be enabled for a dungeon core interface. Only, of course, with so much going on, that doesn't always happen, Evil began with a grin. Weirdly, I can't shut the help ticket for this one DM, Evil began cordially, but their smile wavered. I'd really like it to stop blinking at me, Evil finished, eye twitching ever so subtly. I'll need your login and password to access your help desk, Neutrality replied blandly. It wasn't unusual to find others pushing work off on him, but this was the worst case to date. There weren't hard rules about helping each other. They were expected to with inter-department or close alignment cases. The trouble was that dungeon masters fell under chaos and evil. Neutrality had zero access to them because of that. Sweet, it's ADMIN 6942069, caps on the first letter, no spaces. Password go fuck yourself Kevin all lowercase no spaces, Evil said with a grin. Okay, I'll get on it now, Neutrality replied evenly through sheer force of will. He had no idea how Evil knew his name, but there was no chance it was a coincidence. Evil looked a little disappointed at his lack of reaction. Once Evil retreated in defeat, Neutrality fired up his screen and got to work. Logging in wasn't difficult as both the username and password worked. Though Evil hadn't given the account ID number, Neutrality found it quickly. The problem help ticket was the only one at the top of the queue that didn't disappear after a few seconds. Selecting the Dungeon Master profile, Neutrality found himself looking at an image of a new core. One less than a week old. The picture didn't leave much of an impression. Neutrality didn't have an interest in Dungeon Masters, and her photo had been taken mid-transfer. Predictably she looked nauseous and terrified. What caught his attention, aside from her eye flame's rather attractive color, was her lack of a type code. It wasn't exactly essential, but a type code indicated the reasons an individual had been chosen to be a dungeon. Neutrality didn't usually find them relevant to his work, but the lack was a giant red flag. Opening her files, he started taking a more in-depth look at what was going on. He found two significant anomalies before long. The first was that she'd received a glitch invitation. Neutrality had been tasked with hunting down and eliminating the root cause of those when he first signed on. After a year, he'd given up. He responded to progress inquiries with a vague "I'm working on it" while doing anything but that. What glitch invitations did was straightforward. At least in comparison to how they came about. The Dungeon Master, when she was still human, had encountered another candidate and bested them. Looking up the original candidate, Neutrality didn't find anything interesting. The initial would-be Dungeon Master's ventromedial prefrontal cortex had been poorly connected to his amygdala. His amygdala, in turn, had been undersized. By themselves, those problems were a classic recipe for a used car salesman. His upbringing had exacerbated the issue. His parental guardians had only cared about compliance, not mental health. Instead of addressing the underlying problems, he'd been taught to maintain a thin veneer of normalcy. That indifference combined with the physiological problem had created a boilerplate psychopath. The probability scenarios for the encounter were hilarious. Neutrality took the liberty of making copies to pass around. It was against policy, but it wasn't like he was under his own login anyway. His favorite began with her bailing from the car, then feinting to get back in and lock her passenger out. When he didn't give up and smashed the driver's side window, she'd caught him by the arm. Holding on tight, she accelerated, crashing him into a pole. The look on his face as it happened was priceless. The close runner-up started the same, but she took the tire iron and beat the ever-loving shit out of him. It seemed like a mismatch in the original candidate's favor at first. He had the knife and reach on her, but it didn't help him. Not once she nailed him on the wrist with the tire iron. He lost his composure and grip on the knife. Neutrality immediately emailed the clips to some friends in other departments. With his fun over, he got back to his main task. The second anomaly was her recruiter. Like the type code, the field for it was blank, which was odd. Dungeon masters and related positions were handled by evil personnel. Though they could be lazy and awful, they didn't forget to take credit for things, especially ones that could net them bonuses. It was a bit mysterious, but he shrugged it off. It didn't matter who'd been her recruiter from his perspective. What mattered was figuring out why the help ticket was stuck. He opened the queue to examine the ticket. Looking at it, neutrality had to fight down laughter. It wasn't a ticket. It was a chat log. Unlike a ticket that could be closed, a chat had to be responded to change its state. Since evil never bothered helping, they'd missed that minor issue. It was strange that a help chat had been opened instead of a ticket, though. Tickets were easy to make, so most new dungeon masters started there. Neutrality looked through the dungeon master's account's permissions and found what he expected. The help ticket function was disabled. Humans needed visual and audio cues to navigate the system. Evil had disabled most of those functions, but the system's ways of interfacing weren't so limited. The dungeon master evil had sought to inconvenience had accessed one of the alternatives. Not an easy thing to do. Neutrality was tempted for a very long moment to enable all of the account features. It would streamline the process of helping the dungeon master, but in the end, he didn't. Evil would turn them back off but leave the help ticket on so they could ignore it. That would either put them back at the start with the dungeon master using the workaround or giving up out of frustration. Neither option was appealing to neutrality. Instead, he made up his mind and opened the system coding interface. It was the long way around to make the dungeon master's interface a subsystem and edit it, but it was the best option. The changes would only show up in the build log, which neutrality doubted evil checked. Even if they did, they'd have to manually roll back the changes. That wouldn't be a small amount of work, and neutrality felt confident evil wouldn't bother. Since evil had so graciously handed over their account details to him, it was only fitting that he had some fun. Go fuck yourself, Kevin, indeed, neutrality mused to himself with a cold smile. Chapter 9. Crisis Aversion. Once the core was destroyed, I still had to watch the heroes take a victory lap and start looting. It was uncomfortable to watch. They bagged shards of the core along with anything else that wasn't nailed down. I understood it intellectually. They were the victors, and the dungeon's contents were their spoils. I mean, really, I'd done worse when playing games. Who hadn't committed some home invasion robbery in an RPG? Despite all the logic and humor-based deflection, I shuddered. To them, the core was just sparkly chunks of magic rock. They chatted amiably about how much it was worth and wondered if it could be used in magic items. It was playful party banter about loot. Why yes, Mr. Wizard, this corpse chunk would make lovely earrings. I imagined the thief saying and felt nauseous. To me, they were picking up scattered remains and talking about turning them into knickknacks and jewelry. It was a grisly scene in my eyes. Agony picked up on my distress and floated over to pat me on the shoulder. He wasn't large enough to hug me, but I appreciated him trying to comfort me nonetheless. Hey, it's fine. Everyone gets wrecked the first time, Agony said kindly. From his perch on my shoulder, he patted my head to console me. His hand was a Q-tip-sized dot of warmth, and I tilted my head into the feeling. My body was nearly numb, so even small sensations were rather precious to me. Okay, I acknowledged. I wasn't upset by my poor performance, at least not entirely. I had felt horrified at the fact that actual people were going up against my design. Their blood would have been on my hands had they died. Unfortunately, that wasn't the main reason I felt miserable. The stuff that replaced my guts was twisting in knots because of an unfortunate personal revelation. I knew the heroes were genuine people during the raid. Despite that, I'd only feared for my own safety. I felt like I was in danger, I said, not sure where the feeling had come from. I didn't think that watching the hero party make its way should have affected me that much. It started like ants crawling across my skin and built up to something like a hand around my throat. I couldn't explain why I'd felt it so strongly. I'd know it was a tutorial from the start. I'd initiated it. Yet, it had felt all too real at the time. That's normal. You aren't connected to this dungeon, but you can sense it to a degree. You'll know when someone is inside yours. You'll also feel an instinctive response to the danger they pose, Agony explained. I nodded, accepting the answer since it fit with my experience. That this was the light version of the experience was unwelcomed news. I lacked a human sense of pain, but I had a creeping suspicion that the system wasn't going to let me off scot-free. That would have been a touch too kind going by everything I'd already experienced. I would not be looking forward to this new Dungeon Master exclusive experience. You should take a break. Doing too much at once isn't good for anyone, Agony suggested. The tone of his crackling hearth voice was gentle. When you feel ready, don't hit continue right away. You should review the footage of the raid before starting the next section, he added. Thanks, I'll do that, I said without much enthusiasm. It was sound advice, but I wasn't in the right mindset to appreciate it. The next round is graded. Your performance determines your starter pack and what bonuses you get, Agony said. I hummed in response, and he left me alone. I took Agony's advice and spent some time trying to calm down. The hood hadn't been kidding when he said the system wasn't kind. I hadn't had any rose-tinted delusions of avoiding the problem, but I was only in the tutorial phase. No one had died in the first dungeon I put together, but I had a choice to make. If I spared the next group, my resources would suffer. To do my best, no matter the outcome, I'd have to actively try to kill people for my own benefit. I didn't panic, but I wasn't unfeeling either as I reflected on what I'd have to do. I felt horrible that I was even entertaining the idea of proceeding. How are you doing? Agony inquired after a while. I'm thinking about things, I said, dodging the question. Agony nodded but studied me, his confusion evident in his eyes. Not to pry, but most new cores are excited. Well, arrogant, but you get the idea, he ventured. Really? I asked and then remembered my passenger. It made sense that the people who got standard invites would enjoy themselves. Especially since the system would prevent them from freaking out. This was psychopath heaven or a close equivalent. I got a glitch invite, I explained. Agony paused, blinking hard for a moment as he absorbed what I'd said. Are you? Agony started then stopped with a grimace. I watched him struggle for a few moments before he scrubbed his face with his hands. I wish I had advice or comforting words to give, but I don't, he said finally. I laughed at his bluntness. If the situation were reversed, I wouldn't know what to say either. This wasn't the kind of situation for cowboy speeches. I know what the moral thing to do is, I said unhappily. It was either letting someone destroy my core or wait until my first 2 weeks ran out and accept the penalty. I recalled the hood's warning about not expecting a painless death. Agony looked at me, conflicted, but didn't say anything. What could he? I can't do it, I added. When the hero party had gone through my dungeon, I'd felt something familiar, a straightforward desire to live. That wasn't why I felt guilty. You could still want to live even as you made a moral choice to the contrary. That I wasn't so much as entertaining the idea made me sick. I didn't want to die, and that was all there was to it. I didn't have a special reason or rationalization for it, but that was enough. I wasn't going to bring about my own demise for the greater good. I'm going to start reviewing the raid, I continued, sighing. It would have been nice to blame my cowardice on the system suppressing my feelings, but I didn't. Why the system suppressed panic but not guilt was an irrelevant mystery. Okay, take your time, Agony replied, giving me a tiny pat. It felt odd to have him comfort me now, but I didn't refuse it. He seemed friendly, but he liked his job. Well, not exactly. Agony enjoyed teaching about dungeon design and management. He could live without dickhead students. He also didn't mind that people died to illustrate the lessons. Glitch invites weren't discriminating. At least not about anything other than my ability versus the original recipients. At least that was what the Hood's explanation had led me to believe. I found it comforting that I didn't resemble the usual candidates, but that was its own problem. We were an ethical mismatch, and I hadn't thought to hide it. Agony knew that now, but his demeanor toward me hadn't changed. I felt relieved, though I would have understood if it did. Agony wasn't just an employee but a teacher for Chaos. Yet he still possessed empathy, as far as I could tell. My life would depend on doing something I knew was wrong from now on. That I didn't have to become a cartoon villain was reassuring. Done ruminating for the moment, I started watching the footage of the hero party. Troubling as it was, they were professionals. Knowing how they operated would give me insight into how to improve my design. Engrossing myself in the review process also helped me to clear my head. Having a project to work on made it easier to control my thoughts. It didn't lift my low mood, but it was better than wallowing. I needed to absorb as much as I could to help with the second half of the tutorial. I'd made up my mind to live, so I needed to do what I could to ensure I could. My future victims wouldn't come and happily lay down their lives for me. It would be a life and death struggle for us both. I needed to learn and gain every advantage possible now. When I was ready to get back to work, a continue button had appeared. Once I hit it, the second part of the tutorial would begin. I selected yes. Chapter 10. Hindsight's Dagger. When the second half of the tutorial started, I reviewed my resources. Combining the freebies from prior sections and the current one, they increased significantly. My usable mana was shockingly low. Agony, is this right? I asked. My inside bits, whatever they might be, twisted into knots. I only had 50 mana to work with. The prompts will explain, but yet. The last time was to get familiar with the interface. This time it's simulating day cycles you'll actually experience, Agony explained. Cores come in different grades. You're using the lowest one, an F grade. Your mana pool will refresh daily this time. The raid timing is unpredictable, so be careful, Agony advised. I took a look at my setup and found it was unresponsive. Checking the tutorial prompts, I discovered I had to plant my core before I could begin construction. That was another new issue, and I hesitated to put it down somewhere random. Something wrong? Agony asked. I'm debating where to put the core. I mean, I can move it later, so it doesn't matter, but it's part of an objective. I feel like there's more to it, I explained. If it didn't matter, it wouldn't have been an objective. Despite how barebones the tutorial was in certain ways, none of the content was fluff or busy work. Anywhere's fine. You get a fixed set of starting tiles in here. When placing your actual core, it will matter. It can bury itself, but placing it in a cave or tunnel is better. You get all of the tiles between the core and entrance for free, Agony explained. I nodded and went back to reading. It was a few minutes before I realized that what he said wasn't covered in any of the prompts. I looked at him, and he grinned at me with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. It's relevant to the tutorial even if it's not covered, he said. I appreciated the tip and gave him a careful head pat and thanks. He smirked, pleased with it and himself afterward. Back to work. I placed my free tiles first. I didn't have enough to make anything spectacular, but a maze began to take shape. If the party got lost, that would be nice. If they didn't, it wouldn't matter. I was aiming to make them walk as much as possible in the fewest square feet. According to their descriptions, many of the tiles gave off high heat. In some cases, they were hot enough to inflict a severe status ailment. Hero parties would have countermeasures at their disposal, magical or otherwise. I didn't expect any less, but I didn't give up on this more insidious form of harm. Magic spells, equipment, and special abilities had limits. The idea was to increase the exposure long enough to push past them. If I did it right, the heroes wouldn't be able to counter it with a single method. They'd have to stack preventatives to deal with the brutal environmental conditions. That would eat up equipment slots and other resources for pure survival. It would cut into their ability to counter other aspects of the dungeon or amplify their abilities. It was a good return on investment for the cost. It was also a cruel method, but I didn't have the luxury of kindness. As the defending party, I should have had a steep advantage. Instead, the terrain rules took most of it away from me. There was also the issue of the heroes being purpose-built for taking on my challenges. They had to be to reach the dungeon because of its location in a lava field. That felt unfair, but I shook off the thought, smelling bullshit on it. Thinking like that would get my core kicked in. I had to plan like I was always going to be up against top-tier, mission-specific opponents. Doing otherwise was arrogant and would leave me vulnerable. In the first section, I'd had prompts to guide me by the hand the whole way. This time I got through them in a few minutes, and then I was on my own. Agony, likewise, wasn't chatty this time. He would still help if I ran into a problem and asked, but that was all. It didn't take long for me to exhaust my daily mana. Once I did, I spent the remaining time in the short day cycle playing with the layout until I got bored of it. There were only so many ways I could tweak it before I ran out of juice. With some free time on my hands, I decided to do a little more reading on my species. Most of the information was still opaque to me, but I did learn a few things. Like how I moved was accomplished a similar process to the one from when I was flesh and blood. My body had its own kind of muscle memory, which was nice. I didn't even want to imagine how much of a pain in the ass it would have been to micromanage my form like it was a WASD body game. I could learn to change it through practice. I wiggled my tail in a way even most invertebrates wouldn't be able to manage easily. The substance of my being, Z14, didn't have sensible properties. If I wasn't thinking about my form, I kept a consistent shape. If I concentrated, I could flatten or stretch myself in nauseating ways. With a thought, the nails on my fingers elongated and thickened into claws. The moment my attention wavered, they disappeared. I stretched my tail, then tried splitting it into legs with some temporary success. The limits of my ability to transform seemed to be imagination and focus. Neat. Hey, can you make shapes with your tail? Agony asked. I had no idea but gave it a try. I could manage soft ones but no straight lines. How about you? I asked once I ran out of ideas. No, mine isn't bendy buoot. Agony made a dramatic gesture then took off. Flying fast, his tail seemed to leave a trail of light like a sparkler. Impressed, I clapped after he got done spelling his name. Wanting to do a little better than a misshapen heart, I got back to testing my own limits. While I was playing around with my malleable substance, the day finally ended. A pleasant reminder tone let me know mana refresh had occurred. The short day cycle began anew and was more of the same. I found myself running out of weird tricks to do with my body to keep myself entertained on the third day. It was a little frustrating to play hurry up and wait, but I felt like I'd get used to it. At least I did until the fourth short day. That was when I started to feel something odd, a vague but persistent feeling of dread. It wasn't strong enough to trace it back to a source. Instead, it lingered, haunting my thoughts and causing me to feel dissatisfied with everything. I studied the map unhappily. The lackluster tutorial supplies weren't the best, but that wasn't important. Like in chess, you had a fixed set to work with and rules to abide by. You won because of strategy. All too quickly, I burned through my mana supply. Once again, I spent my remaining time before refresh staring at or moving tiles. Free, but not productive. I was fussing because I couldn't figure out what was bothering me. Something about the basic structure is making me nervous, I said. I didn't expect a reply, but saying things aloud helped me think sometimes. Yeah, you'd be having a panic attack if you were linked to the core, Agony agreed. I looked at him in surprise as an alert sounded to announce that the hero party was inbound. Well, that explained why he'd turned chatty. It didn't count as helping if he told me when it was too late to be helpful. I felt an irritating mixture of amusement and annoyance when he grinned at me. Agony hovered next to the shared view screen. With a few deft movements, he changed the view to show the core room in detail. The design was simple but still thematically appropriate to keep costs down. I'd constructed a massive murderous version of the game. The floor is lava. A winding path led from the entrance to the island where the core was. The path wasn't solid but made up of a combination of fixed stone pylons and floating stones. The floating stones would start to sink after a few moments, so you had to move fast. The fixed pylons were a darker color contrary to my wishes, but it wasn't completely obvious. Despite that, the obstacle set off a build state alarm. To appease the build alarm, I added small islands at intervals to be used as fighting platforms. The core was on one at the very back of the room. To make myself feel a bit better, I'd placed the largest fire elemental I could afford as a guardian for it. The elemental in question was similar to Agony in some ways. The main difference besides its size was the blockier build and inability to fly. I was caught off guard when it turned out to be a bit on the dim side. They didn't speak but could follow simple instructions without an issue. Getting my desires across in that format had taken a couple tries. Frustrated, I'd wanted to ask Agony if this was normal for elementals of that size or a thing with this one particular one. I kept it to myself instead. I felt like that conversation was a great way to get myself in trouble. Agony had been good to me. I didn't want to risk saying something insensitive or insulting by accident. I needed to keep my head in the game, not worry about things I couldn't do anything about now. The real question would be if the hero's heat resistance was up to the job. It was something we'd both have to wait to find out about. Still, I couldn't help but look for flaws. Agony had changed the view for a reason, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong despite the clue. It was beyond frustrating, but I hadn't noticed the problem in the build phase. That I wouldn't suddenly get it now wasn't strange. An average archer could land a couple of mana-reinforced arrows and do damage. A good one could crack a weak core like this on their own, Agony explained. He was pointing at a section that hadn't looked special in map view. Felicity, I muttered as I looked over the design. Snipers weren't something I'd considered when I was building it. I'd been trying to save some mana and left many original elements in place this time. The result was ledges and alternate entrances to the boss room around the periphery of the room. Most of which were convenient sniping points. I hadn't noticed them in the 2D view and could only kick myself now. No worries, this isn't supposed to be too realistic. You might not get as high a score, but that's all, Agony said in a comforting tone that did nothing for me. On cue, the heroes came to challenge my dungeon. A vibration coursed through me without warning. I shivered as something like a river of acid ran down my spine. Acid of the etching variety, not the fun one. I knew in my pseudo-flesh it was a premonition of death. Chapter 11. Thermodynamic Surprise. Looking at the holes in my defenses didn't make them disappear. Unfortunately, knowing that wasn't the least bit comforting. I'd been thinking of a classical party setup with a tank and mage when designing the layout. Lots of games had archers, but they usually weren't primary damage dealers. Now I had images of elves storming the place and parkouring their way to the core room. That dark fantasy ended with them exploding the core with arrows. It also brought an end to my mental break time. I had until the hero's party reached my core room to try and figure out a way to fix its defenses. A task easier said than done. I was already out of mana. I racked my brain for an idea. Beyond being out of mana, the rules of how the dungeon worked changed once a raid was initiated. Alterations that were usually free or cheap suddenly had a steep price tag. New items cost triple. Moving tiles cost their value in mana per square moved. Even if I'd had any mana left, I probably wouldn't have been able to do anything useful with it. That left my only option as using what remained in my inventory. I opened it but didn't feel hopeful. I'd already put everything I thought would be helpful into the original layout. I only had some trash-grade leftovers I'd gotten as rewards in the prior section left. In a moment like this, the ideal solution would be to make up for quality with strategy. Unfortunately, tactics under pressure weren't my thing. On the upside, I didn't have time to second-guess my choices. I placed the remaining traps in a fire rat nest. I could only hope they would shore up some of the weak points. Agony looked at my last-ditch attempt with a raised stone eyebrow but didn't say anything. There wasn't a penalty even if I did terribly, but I crossed my fingers and hoped to do well all the same. Agony had said I'd get rewards based on the outcome. I was desperate for any starting advantage I could get. I'd decided to live as a dungeon core and wasn't going to half-ass it. I watched nervously as the hero party began to explore. Things went well at first. The party was wearing heat-resistant armor and items, but they weren't enough to block it completely. The priest had to cast elemental resistance to make up for the deficit. That reduced his ability to support the party, fortunately for me. Another plus for me was that his spell wasn't entirely up to the job. Once they were out of the dungeon's cooler entry section, they started taking minor heat damage. It wasn't enough to harm any of them, but it did impart the overheated status ailment. That was a much bigger win than pure damage. Its effect on their overall performance was visible. They were fatigued, needing rest breaks frequently and after fights. Unfortunately, that only slowed their stalwart advance of doom toward the dungeon's core. Some fared better than others. The combat-specialized mage, in particular, wasn't doing well. He was an older man, not quite flowing white beard old but still up there. In all honesty, he'd endured well under the circumstances. He collapsed from heat exhaustion a third of the way in. The party wasn't heartless. They halted their mission when the mage collapsed. The priest did what he could, but his spells were already at their limit. They chose to try and carry the mage out. If they'd had a little more time or some more appropriate healing spells, he might have survived. He died halfway to the exit. I felt bad watching it. That was a miserable way to die, and his death didn't convince his party to quit. Instead, they took a break in the cooler portion of the dungeon. It was infuriating to watch them. The thief, archer, and warrior healed up with items. The priest restored his mana with potions. They needed a break because they were tuckered out from kicking in my defenses. This was a blatantly adding insult to injury. The only upside was restoring his mana didn't improve the quality of the priest's spells. Despite knowing how punishing the interior of the dungeon was, they continued. It didn't take long for them to take back the ground they'd given up. The party moved faster because they didn't have to try and match the wizard's pace. They got back to ripping through my already compromised defenses with renewed zeal. It wasn't the heat that claimed the next party member, at least not directly. They were all suffering, but the rogue was impatient and proud. He didn't want to rest as often as the others. What claimed his life wasn't the heat but carelessness. The thief ranged too far ahead on his own and came up against a small salamander. Small being relative as it was the size of a German shepherd discounting the tail. He fought well but was more fragile than the rest of his party. The fight took a toll on him, and in the end, he made a mistake. The salamander looked dead, and the thief paused to wipe the sweat from his eyes. It ripped his throat out before he had time to finish the motion. It was the most basic of mistakes, always double tap. And then there were 4. I muttered to myself. I wished I had fingernails to bite or something. It felt weird to have nervous energy but nowhere to spend it. I supposed I should be grateful. I wasn't treated to another horrific dungeon master-only experience, at least. I put my focus back on the party. The priest, fighter, archer, and tank were still a nasty combo. With every obstacle they passed, I could feel the inevitability of my demise growing. It was an unpleasant experience, to say the least. On their own, they might not have made it to the core, but there was still the archer. The core guardian was a lava elemental with the intellect of a brick. With the other 3 tying the guardian up, the archer would be free to take pot shots at the core. Even if he was terrible, he'd hit it eventually. The tank and fighter would be able to handle the core guardian with the priest's support. Felicity, sublime, heaven. I muttered to myself. I tried willing them to fail with my mind, only to see them overcome my carefully planned defenses. The group was battered by the time it reached the core room, but not out by any means. I still had a little hope left, but it was crushed in short order. Not having a rogue, the tank took point. I watched in horror as he bashed through my traps like they weren't there. They were finally in the core room. Unfortunately, they followed my prediction about the formation. The priest, tank, and fighter went for a direct assault and pulled the lava elemental. It ran to them like an excited puppy. "Let's observe from close up," Agony said, and the air shimmered. We appeared in the core room on a ledge that let us overlook the boss room. The hero party was already locked in combat with the elemental below us, but they were missing a member. The archer had already peeled off from the party to search the edges of the room. It didn't take him long to find some uneven basalt pillars and climb up to a ledge above the one Agony, and I were on. The core was still far away, but his vantage let him see it clearly. "Oh fuck you!" I growled, wishing I had a rock or something to throw at him. I grabbed for a loose bit of stone. "You can't affect anything in here. The tutorials are supposed to focus on management, not combat," Agony explained. My hand passed through the stone like a hologram. I let out a frustrated sigh. Now I could only hope the Guardian finished the assault team quickly. If I got lucky, the Guardian might reorient and go for the archer. I wasn't fortunate. The group taking on the Guardian was doing fine. They were in a punishing stalemate but not taking severe damage. The elemental was led by the nose as they moved the fight along the entry platform. In short order, it had its back to the archer. I was utterly screwed. With an easy win at hand, it was the archer who surprised both Agony and I. My hastily placed fire rats started to attack. Despite biting at his boots, they couldn't penetrate the elemental resistance spell. Like my shitty traps that hadn't slowed the party down, it was embarrassing to watch them fail. That was when things started to get weird. The archer wasn't in any danger from them but responded with a strange fervor. He stood up to face them and started stomping. Below, his party was waiting for him to finish the main fight, unaware of the madness that had seized him. "Wow!" Agony said as we watched the scene unfold. Boots slick with gore, the archer lost his footing and fell from his perch into the lava below. His party heard the thump and then the hiss of flesh burning. Only that wasn't quite right. The noise took a sharp turn, like the scream of a human-sized tea kettle. "Lawful hells!" Agony said and started laughing so hard his little body bounced on my shoulder. The scent of ham filled the air as the sound crescendoed. A split second later, an explosion rang out. The archer's body had superheated and exploded. I'd never seen anything like it. Watching in rapt horror, a bit of him splattered against me. I brushed it off absent-mindedly. I was distracted by trying to decide what to do with my newly acquired information. Short of brain bleach, I was stuck knowing how a human body reacted to lava. I could have lived without knowing that. The core chamber descended into chaos as the priest broke formation. He didn't seem to understand the archer was beyond help immediately. Distracted, he was looking the wrong way, and the lava guardian knew it. Its fist came barreling toward the priest. The tank managed to get between them and block it, but at a cost. He wasn't able to get a firm footing. Stance compromised. He was brought down to his knees by the next attack. Dazed, he let out a scream as the third attack connected. He ragdolled for a few yards, landing in a broken heap on the entry steps. It spared him his comrade's explosive final fate, but that was all. Only seconds had passed between the successive attacks. The priest just had enough time to turn around and freeze. It was as if how he'd fucked up was sinking in during the split second before the guardian killed him. The priest's death spelled the end of the elemental protection spell. As a fighter, the last man standing was royally screwed. His gear wasn't up to the task of shielding him from the environment, and he had no relevant magic ability. It was almost merciful that the Guardian put him down before the spell failed. It was better than the grotesque alternatives like combusting or boiling in his own skin. I heard a tinkle of bells. A moment later, the practice dungeon shimmered out of existence. Chapter 12. Valedictorian Blues. The world around me shifted. I found myself on a pristine black sand beach beneath an ashen sky lit with a sullen glow. The glowing lava field full of caves where I'd taken my tutorial sat behind me. A festive banner hung between two palm trees. A and newbie, it read. A prompt appeared, listing my tutorial rewards as the sky lit up with fireworks. I stared at the celebration of my achievement, numb. My mind burned with the psychological desire to throw up. No action came of it, the awful sensation remained with me instead. I'd killed 6 people. Time passed as I processed that thought. For how long, I wasn't sure. I remained on the beach with my guilt. Finally, a touch of warmth broke me out of my thoughts. Agony sat on my shoulder, trying to comfort me. He patted me, looking concerned. "You did good," he said as if to convince me. I nodded, not wanting to worry him. "I had an excellent teacher," I replied sincerely. Earlier I'd wished my body was closer to human standard. That I could express myself in more familiar ways. For the first time, I was thankful that I couldn't. I doubted I could hold myself together if I could cry. "Mind if I send you a friend request?" Agony asked. "Please do," I said without a second thought. The tutorial was over, and I'd soon be returning to start my actual dungeon. It'd be lonely only knowing 2 people total in this new world. It was why I hesitated to hit the return prompt when it appeared. I could have had my little catatonic episode back in the desert as easily as on the beach. "Thinking about something?" Agony inquired. Under the more obvious self-loathing for what I'd done, there was another layer of anxiety. Just wishing I hadn't won because of luck, I admitted. This was my life now. If it had been my actual core in that dungeon, I might well have died. I'd won because I'd gotten lucky. I didn't want to cling to luck for the rest of my life. Well, it's designed to be unfair. Everyone gets a basic starting pack even if they skip. Doing the tutorial gets you a better one plus a performance bonus. "You were doing great even when you'd only killed 2 members of the party," Agony said as he leaned over conspiratorially. "Not bad for my first try, then?" I asked and gave a desolate chuckle. "Not bad at all," Agony agreed and extended a fist. I returned the gesture, tapping his hand with one of my knuckles. I hated myself for the sense of accomplishment it gave me, but I still felt a little better. If I have to kill to survive, then I need to be good at it. "All right, I should go. Text me later," I said finally. Agony got off my shoulder, and we exchanged a wave before I ended the tutorial. The world shimmered, and Agony disappeared along with the beach. When it cleared, I was back in the desert next to my chair. The first thing I did was check my countdown. Almost no time had passed. I hadn't been able to keep track in the tutorial, but I hadn't forgotten I was up against the clock. With that worry dealt with for the moment, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. I'd learned a lot in the tutorial, but starting an action plan from scratch was best done after thinking it through. Checking the manual crossed my mind. I opened it, but skimming the table of contents revealed no relevant subjects. It dealt more with later stage dungeon management than setup. I was glad I'd chosen to do the tutorial first. The basics were simple, and I made a list of required features in my head. The critical point was a cave or other underground spot. The deeper it was, the more starting tiles I'd receive. It was time to get moving. I shrieked in surprise when part of my vision went fuzzy after moving a couple of yards. A few terror-inducing seconds later, a map window appeared in the corner of my eye. I glared at it resentfully for making me think I was going blind, however briefly. Once my resentment subsided, I studied it carefully. Like an old-school JRPG, it had colored dots and a few symbols overlaying a crude topographical schematic. A green arrow represented me and which direction I was facing. A red dot marked where I'd left my chair. That was everything there was to see, though to be fair, I'd only gone 10 yards when it appeared. Game stuff is good, I muttered. I wasn't sure if I was stating the obvious or trying to convince myself. I didn't have the luxury of enjoying surprises right now. Shaking the incident off, I continued exploring. I ignored the desert proper and turned my attention to the mountain range. Could I find a sinkhole or cave in a stone formation in the sand? Maybe, but that wasn't an efficient use of my time. The map proved invaluable the longer I traveled. It kept me from needing to backtrack. Significant features I stumbled across were registered with yellow question tokens. My first night passed uneventfully while I scoured my surroundings. I'd initially been placed near the end of the mountain range where the desert curved off. It took most of the night, but I eventually traveled to the foothills of the mountain proper. From there, I climbed high enough to see where the sand ended and scrubland began. Further on, the rough scrubland vegetation gave way to grass. The area wasn't ideal, but at least I knew I wasn't missing out on anything. Once I was done, I could head deeper into the mountains without worry. That would come later, though. I paused when a yellow light peeked out from over the horizon. A single sun was rising, and I watched my first sunrise with interest. Unlike the night sky, the dawn was a bit dull. I knew on a certain level it was because the air here was cleaner than my old world. It was funny how decades of steadily worsening air pollution resulted in more vibrant colors. I was amused by how underwhelming it was in comparison to the night. With the first rays of light, I noticed thin plumes of gray rising. Smoke, a sure sign of habitation of some kind. The sun's light exposed me, but I ignored the discomfort as I resumed exploration. I continued down the last mountain of the range until it dissolved into foothills. There I found the smoke's source. A small town nestled among the hills at the end of the range. Looking at it made me uncomfortable. I was vulnerable to attack, but also because my interest in it was less than humane. I wasn't looking for neighbors. I was sizing up a potential source of points. Creeping as close as I dared, I hid among the stones on a hill overlooking the town. For half the day, I observed them despite feeling shitty about it. Watching a detail-oriented Ren Fair-like scene, it was hard to follow anything. Figuring out what was relevant to my interests was beyond me. Even how they went about their lives was challenging to discern. Too much was going on all at once. It wasn't until noon I picked up on a pattern. People and horses' movement was chaotic to watch, but it seemed like the town sold them. There was a thin but steady trickle of outsiders coming in for them. I liked the look of that. It meant the town wasn't isolated from the outside world. It might even be on a trade route of some kind. I didn't want seasoned adventurers to come knocking on my dungeon's door right away, but I'd need to attract them eventually. Using the town as a reference point, I turned and headed deeper into the mountains. After passing the previously explored areas, I reached new grounds before nightfall. The further in I went, the more the aesthetic of the landscape changed. Near the end of the range, the mountains had been unimpressive. They lost out to the desert for beauty and interest. Now they held their own with intricate stone formations and wind-swept foothills. The aesthetic of the landscape shouldn't have mattered, but I couldn't help myself. I wanted to live in a place with a beautiful view. Still, no matter how much I liked its looks, there were practical concerns to be addressed. Searching diligently, I came to a small valley nestled between the peaks. It laid behind an intricate series of winding passages carved from stone by wind or water. It was like a natural labyrinth. That was a good omen, right? The valley itself was bound on both sides by stone cliffs. They displayed colorful bands of orange and red on their faces. Beneath them, the floor was carpeted in green. A thick layer of sand and soil provided a foothold for life. A waterfall from the mountain created a river that divided the valley down the middle. At its end was a small lake. I fell in love. Despite that, I steeled my heart and continued scouting. I needed to find a cave if possible. The deeper, the better. It seemed like the valley reciprocated my feelings. I found an abandoned mine. The mine was tucked into the stone of the mountain at the back of the valley on the river's left side. It was perfect. With Agony's teachings as my guide, I moved quickly to explore the depths of the mine. My mind was wholly on the task of finding the deepest possible point to plant my core. Beyond netting me extra starting tiles, it would provide protection against mishaps. I hadn't experienced it in real time in the tutorial, but planting a core took 2 days. It was a vulnerable period. My access to the dungeon building system wouldn't come online until it was done. I also wouldn't be able to move the core again until the process was finished. If I was found by an enemy at the moment like that, I was screwed. My core wasn't fragile, it was a crystal sphere a meter in diameter, but that was all. It would be tough to break by normal means, but this was a world of swords and sorcery. I wasn't going to take needless risks. My desires aside, I spent a day exploring before I gave up trying to go deeper in the mine. There might have been deeper passages, but I could explore for weeks if I didn't draw a line. The mine had been dug by hand but intersected with a natural cave system. It was too large and complex to even begin to explore. Someone without my map function would have been lost within a few hours. Since I hadn't been able to find a lower passage, I returned to the lowest point I'd found. With the location settled, I opened my inventory for the first time. Inside were the spoils I'd received from the tutorial. Nested among them sat a single green-blue sphere. I felt an instant fondness for it, the color suiting my taste. I summoned it and set it on the ground with care. Activate core? Y/N. The system inquired, and I selected yes. Nothing much happened at first. My core sat there like a lump. It was a few minutes before it began emitting a faint hum and glowing with a dim internal light. As it came online, I found it looked prettier than before. Its present lively state making its prior sleepiness seem dull and unattractive. I ran my hand along the smooth surface and felt a cool sensation. I didn't understand how, but I knew it was a part of me in an essential way. A connection more intimate than what my vague species description had mentioned. It was the same as the beating heart of another creature. I couldn't live without it. Wanting to protect it, I coiled myself around it in a way a human body wouldn't have been able to manage. The relaxed feeling spread from it through my pseudo-flesh soothingly. I almost felt drowsy even though I no longer needed to sleep. I was slow to notice when a new prompt appeared. Core integration in 10 seconds. Prepare for core integration sickness. Confused, I wondered, what the fuck is integration? Then the countdown hit 0, and I blacked out. Chapter 13. Deadly Pursuit. Across the plains beyond the Malthus Desert, 2 groups were locked in a race. Chased to the point of desperation, the bandits headed straight for the coral pink sands. It was a gamble to cross unfamiliar land, but they'd been trying and failing to shake their pursuers. Behind them, the 10 soldiers of Earl Savik's were doggedly set on their trail. Morale was low, but no longer because they wished to be done with their work. Instead, it was because they couldn't understand how they'd kept the trail. The bandits had used every trick to try and shake them. On any other day, they would have shaken off their pursuers, or at least increased their lead. Instead, every trick cost them time and exhausted their mounts. Even when all signs of them vanished, it was never more than an hour before Tiller found the trail again. It was an eerie thing, even to the soldiers, but they kept it to themselves. The soldiers only paused once in their pursuit, at the edge of a sea of pink coral sand of Malthus. All but one were Midlanders or coastal folk. Some hadn't even known the word desert, let alone seen one. To pass beyond the boundary of the Savik's earldom was momentous. Now they had left any semblance of Dreadmer, the kingdom in which they'd been born. Across the coral sands and through the howling winds of a sandstorm, they kept on. In the end, they navigated a great stone labyrinth to the valley beyond. In that unexpected spot of green nestled in the Laurel Mountains, the bandits could finally run no further. Near to their goal, the soldiers made camp in the maze near the valley exit awaiting nightfall. The mood of the soldiers was tired, but pleased to be nearly done, though danger still lay ahead. Tiller was pacing around his campfire, only to occasionally stop and stare vacantly. Having camped with him for a few days, Aleem paid it no mind as he fixed their dinner. Tiller had already given an absurdly detailed recon report of the valley, but continued until the very moment the sun set. Despite Tiller's apprehension, a plan of attack was made. They all rode together across 2/3 of the valley. It was a cloudy night, so there was little chance of being seen, despite a lack of cover. Dismounting, they did a final gear check and prepared to go. As a scout, Tiller was to be left with the horses and excess gear. No one suggested he come along, but more than a few looks of contempt found him in the dark. Bit of a coward, even for a scout, someone grumbled before they were out of earshot. Better than being too dumb to realize what your job is, Aleem shot back with a smile. That earned a few harumphs and displeased snorts, but the group quieted down. They had a long walk ahead of them, but no guarantee there weren't any sentries. Setting a fast pace, they reached their target at the back of the valley. Right where Tiller had said it would be, was an odd shed. From the description alone, they hadn't been able to guess its use. Seeing it up close, they were still stumped. They didn't spend much time mulling over the issue either. True to the report, it didn't have any windows or side openings to exploit and was unfortunately long. That was what they needed to focus on. After some discussion, they decided to smoke the bandits out. It was a simple tactic. Killing bandits as they fled coughing into the night wasn't heroic. That wasn't the point, though. It would get the job done safely, and that was enough for them. Half the unit went to gather materials. The rest began inspecting the building, looking for convenient gaps. They wanted to avoid setting the building itself on fire. That would weaken the structure and make the blaze unpredictable. While inspecting the building, Aleem noticed a strange sound and followed it. It led him around to the back of the shed, where it butted up to the stone cliff forming the valley's walls. It turned out to be the wind whistling through a small opening. Carefully he peered inside at the dim interior. The bandits' hooded lantern spilled just enough light to illuminate a problem. "It backs up to a cave or something," Aleem explained in a whisper once he was a safe distance away. The plan to smoke the bandits out was discarded after Kells suggested it might be a mine. If the bandits ran in, that would be a disaster. There was no telling how deep it went or how twisting the path. No one wanted to go in, but they couldn't risk losing the bandits either. They needed some kind of proof, preferably the longbow and some heads, to return in triumph. Changing their plans, they paused to get ready for a frontal assault. It wasn't ideal, but they didn't want to end up riding back empty-handed after so much work. Unfortunately, none of them had more than a buckler for a shield. A less than ideal situation, but larger shields were costly and heavy to carry. None of them had thought to buy one in addition to the issued buckler. "After we breach, Bell and Corey stay behind to tear the door off and then rush the archer," Griffin offered. His plan earned nods. It wasn't much of one, but it was what they could manage, and no one had a better alternative. With that decided, Anders stepped up to try and unlock the door. They'd knock it down if they had to. Despite that, it would be better to get an advantage through stealth if they could. Using a knife between the narrow gap between the doors, he tried to find a latch or bar. He found one, but the moment it unlocked, a faint tinkle of bells was heard. The latch had been trapped, and he moved out of the way. The rest of the unit stormed the building immediately and were greeted with an arrow. No matter if the bell had sounded or not, it seemed like at least the archer had been awake and ready for them. One arrow struck home in the chest of Rastin during the rush. The unlucky man fell to the ground dead. The arrows that followed flew past harmlessly into the darkness. The archer retreated behind a partial barrier of crates made just inside the tunnel. After the initial mad dash, the soldiers waited, standing on either side of the mine's entrance. They needed the two still at the shed entrance to tear a door free. Pressed against the stone wall, Elim gave a silent prayer to several gods. The rest of the soldiers who had the presence of mind left to do it were doing likewise. Bell and Corey, both built like bulls, had wrenched the door free across the shed. By all rights, Elim should have been focused on them or thinking about the fight ahead. Instead, he was concentrating on the wall behind him. It wasn't much, but he would have sworn that he felt a strange vibration against this back. Looking down toward his hand, he was just in time to notice the stone glow faintly blue-green for a moment. As the light disappeared, so did the vibration. Alarmed, Elim stepped forward, wanting to warn Griffin that something wasn't right. Cal, who'd been standing with his eyes closed, trying to find his courage, sprang into action. He slammed into Elim as he rushed to begin the assault on the tunnel. Knocked off balance and into the path of the other men, Elim found himself pushed into the mouth of the tunnel. It was not where he wanted to be, and he looked for cover as he tried to get his balance. The twang of a bowstring didn't reach his ears until he already felt a stinging pain in his chest. He blacked out, never seeing the pale white fletching sticking out below his shoulder. Anders pulled Elim out of the way as Bell and Corey began their charge. A lucky shot caught Corey in the leg, and he faltered, but Bell continued with ease. Viciously the archer leveled another shot to kill Corey rather than bother with the better covered Bell. As Bell passed them, the other soldiers got up and used him as cover to advance. With the archer foiled, the other bandits prepared to defend their position. Their confidence in their skills turning to fear. Instead of waiting for single combat, the soldiers brandished spears. The door looked like a thorn bush on either side. None of them were particularly well-educated men, but they were Savik's soldiers. Unlike other military forces made up of conscripts, they were trained volunteers. They didn't know much in the way of tactics. The Earl had focused on beating one fundamental concept into them. So much so, it was imprinted on their bones. Never fight fair. They weren't knights, and it wasn't a tournament. All that mattered was doing what they were told and coming back alive. In that order. Chapter 14. Defensive Impetus. I came to still wrapped around my core, my skull on the verge of exploding. The pain was a strange pulsing pressure that blurred my vision and made me nauseous when I tried to move. Instinctively I checked my core for damage, groping with my hands. The logical part of me knew I wouldn't have woken up if anything had happened to it. A primal part of me still needed to check. I didn't find so much as a hairline fracture, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the pain. I clutched at my head as a sharp jab lanced through my temples. My body spasmed in a way things with bones couldn't. The pain wasn't rooted in physical sensation like humans. No tendons or muscles tightened. It more than made up for the difference with overwhelming intensity. I tried to focus through the pain, ignoring my blurry vision. The only thing I could see clearly was the countdown to the end of the year ticking away. Dread crept up as I watched. As the timer ticked down, another nameless anxiety took hold. Something was wrong. My species description hadn't mentioned anything like this. My first thought was to try opening the manual and looking for an answer. As the pain continued, I thought there was something strange about the way it throbbed. It was nothing like the pulse of a heart, but something about the pattern was familiar. Red alert. The warning siren for a dungeon raid had wailed to the same beat. Unmute alarm, I said, and my immediate area was filled with flashing light and a siren. Mute alarm, I said quickly. Though my pain didn't disappear, the sound and light show did. I'd muted it during the tutorial, and the settings didn't reset it. Panic urged me to stay coiled around my core and guard it, but I fought the urge off. Opening my dungeon map, I was treated to an odd sight. There were two groups of symbols denoting raiders in different shades of red. Two distinct groups appeared to be fighting with each other from what I could make out. I couldn't exactly make out what was happening, thanks to my fuzzy eyes. Even so, I could tell that health bars kept flickering above them. In the tutorial, that only happened when party members took damage. My orbs flickered as I took in that bit of weirdness. Hopefully, they wiped each other out entirely. Either group would be enough to end me if they finished the fight and decided to go exploring. That thought reminded me of something from the tutorial. When the core in the test was threatened, I'd felt uncomfortable because of a weakness in its defense. Hadn't Agony said I'd have a panic attack if I was linked? What I was feeling didn't exactly fit that description, but it was close enough. I'd placed my core deep in the mine, but its only defense was distance and a few inconvenient terrain elements. It was basically unguarded. The instinctive part of me sensed that and was rightfully terrified. Fun stuff. The best I could do for myself under the circumstances was to put some obstacles and monsters in place. If I did that and the pain lessened or stopped, then I could let the intruders kill each other in peace. I wasn't going to look gift points in the mouth. I zeroed in on my interface. The wobbly numbers eventually revealed that I had 100 mana to work with. Assuming that was the whole day's worth, my core was a first level E grade. The countdown put me at 9 hours from a refresh. A tricky situation since the raid status multiplied costs. I could remember roughly where a patch of stalagmites was in the mine. If I copied and bought those, I'd have an extra terrain impediment between the hostiles and my core. Trap and monster-wise, I decided to use what I already had in my inventory. The tutorial had been pretty generous. I'd be fine using what it gave me until refresh rolled around. Hopefully. Phew, I hissed. Everything in my vision squirmed and swam. It took me 3 tries to buy a tile. The cherry on top of that shit sundae was I accidentally bought 2. The red selection outline betrayed me as my finger slid drunkenly when I went to pick the one I wanted. It was a method I'd resorted to when it kept jittering wildly all over the map as I tried to do it mentally. A prompt appeared, but I couldn't read it. I even tried a couple of ways to zoom in hopes it would become legible at a larger size, to no avail. I couldn't change the size, and its content remained squirmy squiggles. Read aloud, I said, hoping I'd trigger some kind of text-to-speech function. Nothing happened. I wasn't sure if it was because my thoughts were a mess or if that wasn't a feature. A moment later, a prompt. For no apparent reason, this one was legible and in an unfamiliar font. The regular one was sans serif, and I could clearly see little feet on the bottom of this one. That was irritating on a spiritual level. UIs should only use one font for plain text. Would you like to upgrade your user interface, UI? Cost, 1 point. You have 0 points. You cannot upgrade your UI at this time. I stared at the prompt up for a few moments, so pissed off I forgot I was in pain. Not only was the system freemium, it apparently enjoyed reminding me I was broke. Bastard. There was only so much time I could and was willing to spend glaring at an inanimate object. I closed or at least threw the prompt and the prior one to the left. I wasn't sure if it was effective, but I didn't have to look at them. For a moment, I recalled how I'd blocked a path in the tutorial. I had tiles that could do so in my starter set. It would be easy to make the dungeon impassable and boot these jackasses out of it. I only considered the idea for a brief moment. Agony had warned me not to during a raid. Despite the temptation it presented, I resisted. I couldn't imagine Agony had gone against the system like that for no reason. Back to the current matter at hand, I gave up on trying to buy existing tiles. Instead, I opened my store and looked for something convenient to obstruct the path with. After 2 tries resulting in irritating error tones, I gave up on that as well. Until I could read the prompts telling me what was wrong, I was better off placing things from my inventory. I put a light repeating crossbow with a tripwire trap and immediately felt my pain lessen. It was only a slight decrease, but enough to be noticeable. Feeling hopeful, I kept placing items and monsters. Despite that, the experience didn't repeat. "Oh, come on!" I shouted to no one in particular. I checked up on the group still fighting near the entrance of the dungeon. Half an hour had passed as I muddled through placing things despite being half blind. The closer group had moved deeper into the tunnel while the other was still at the entrance. Seeing the new arrangement gave me pause. One of the closer group's members had broken off from the rest and was exploring the entrance tunnel. That in and of itself wasn't a huge issue. My main concern was he'd thwarted one of the traps I'd placed to get as far as he had. It was a weak pitfall, little more than a hole with a spike in the bottom and a rotted board over it camouflaged with dirt. Even so, he'd gotten past it without injury. Why I was still in pain finally clicked in my head. I hadn't been able to use monsters and traps with complex placement requirements. The ones I'd been able to use weren't enough to stand up to the potential threat. My core was better protected but still vulnerable. Fuck. Looking through my inventory, I spotted something I'd missed before. My prize for getting a good score in the tutorial, elemental fire hounds. Lava dogs, as I called them. I needed to stop renaming things. I wasn't good at it. They were mid-tier monsters with few restrictions, so I took them out immediately. They appeared at my side, stepping out of a slight red shimmer in the air. Like Agony, they shared a similar dog-like form, but that was all. Their bodies were composed of black stone with veins of lava revealing a molten core beneath. I hadn't thought about it during the tutorial, but the heat coming from them was intense. They threw off enough to leave scorch marks on stone and make the air shimmer around them. It was a comforting sight under the circumstances, and my pain lessened considerably this time. I'd almost call it tolerable, which was a good sign. "Follow me. We have some uninvited guests to deal with," I said flatly, heading for the entrance. This wasn't the tutorial anymore. I could act in my own defense. Chapter 15. Cake or Death. The situation turned into a stalemate after they killed one particularly slow bandit. The rest were retreating deeper into the mine. As they went, the ground became increasingly uneven and littered with small stones. Under the circumstances, Bell could only advance so fast carrying his unwieldy door shield. With the archer still in play, the rest couldn't close the distance even if they felt brave. "What the fuck?" Kel asked the air or possibly the gods. Down the tunnel, something was coming that looked strange. It was like thin threads of light moving fast. "What are you, Jules?" Who was behind him, asked. Kel pointed, leaning around as far as he dared. That was when a fire suddenly broke out along with a strange hissing scream. He squinted before going pale. The fire was a man whose clothes had caught fire. As the flames spread, they illuminated his form better, but he didn't roll or try to put himself out. The man was obviously dead, making it all the more terrifying when two lattice works of glowing cracks peeled off from the flames and continued coming closer. A deep bang split the air as the two creatures dashed forward. Sleek dog-like bodies were revealed, and the soldiers froze in place. They could only watch in horror as the pair of creatures descended on the bandits. Despite all the trouble they'd suffered, the soldiers would have warned them if they could have. They still felt an instinct to band together with their own kind against a monstrous threat. The strange scream rang out again, agony mixed with a whistling sound. This time Kel knew it wasn't the product of the man's throat. Where the creature bit him steamed, the hiss of ruined flesh joining his screech of pain. A higher, more playful bang split the air. Having finished their grisly work, the two creatures moved to either side of the tunnel and sat down. They looked like obedient hunting dogs at that moment, and the men felt a collective shiver of fear. Slowly something was advancing between the hounds. Something vaguely human-shaped but seen only in outline against the dull light of the beasts. All that stood out from its form was a general impression of femininity, that in green fire flickering where eyes should have been. "Surrender," came a hissing voice from within the darkness. A voice that sounded alluring and wrong. As if one's lover and mother were somehow speaking at once. Alone in the dark with only the fire of burning bodies and the hounds to see by, the soldiers stood frozen. The ones of weaker spirit knelt almost immediately. The rest edged back, wanting to run but afraid to turn their backs. "Kneel," she hissed, voice soft but filling the tunnel. The hounds stood then and growled, which was enough to convince the more courageous to comply. Only Belle remained standing. The hounds advanced a step just to halt at a gesture from the shadow woman. Belle threw the door and ran but only got a few steps before tripping. "I'm interested in information, not your lives," she said. Belle hit the ground without covering his head and was knocked out. The woman let out a sigh but didn't sick the dogs on him or anyone else. "As I mentioned, you're all in luck. So let's make a deal, shall we?" she continued. Her words offered a way out, but the soldiers only felt despair. Stories with creatures who wanted to make deals never ended well. At least not for the humans in their experience. "I suggest you all consider my offer seriously. It's a chance to heal your wounded and save your lives," she added, sounding exasperated. The soldiers awaited an offer to be made only to yelp in fear when glowing white squares appeared before them. They'd only heard of such things in religious texts as the way gods communicated with mortals. Despite that, none of them felt they were dealing with a holy being. "Offer. 2 healing potions, small. 150 silver coins. In exchange for keeping secrets. You will not disclose details of what occurred in the mine after your fight with the bandits ended. You may mention encountering monsters, but it must be vague. You cannot say anything about, name pending, known to you as the woman. It is suggested you say you ran once the monster appeared. Accept, yes/no." Several soldiers accepted without reading, hoping to hasten their inevitable end. The rest were reading or trying to get someone literate to read it to them. Disbelief was the general mood as they went over the offer. Like divine communication, potions were the province of stories, not real things. In the end, they accepted as much because of curiosity and greed as fear. 150 silver coins wasn't a small amount, especially to have all at once. As soon as the deal was done, leather coin purses and strangely shaped bottles appeared on the ground in front of them. "Take the coins, and drink the potion to heal your wounds," the woman commanded. Everyone obeyed about the coins but most didn't drink the potion and pocketed them. "Oh, he can't drink because he's unconscious. Wake him up," and some helped the one dying in the back, the blonde one with the arrow sticking out of him. "If you're confused," she explained, sounding annoyed. Several heads turned. They'd forgotten about Elim but could see his chest still rising and falling. Anders helped Belle to wake up and accept the deal. The big man actually took one of the potions and drank it in a moment of confusion, thanks to his head wound. The rest of the soldiers watched in awe as the wound closed almost instantly. In the end, the only trace of the head injury was the blood it had already shed. "Moving on," she said, humming to herself as a hand went to her face. "Since you're all being so cooperative, I'd like to test a few things," she said after a longer pause than before. Her words managed to reignite the soldiers' terror. This was the sort of thing the stories talked about. They all feared what heinous thing she might demand of them. "Well, give me a set of your clothes and equipment," she replied. That brought a long confused pause. The soldiers tried to figure out why she either wanted to rob them or just see them naked but couldn't. A growl from one of the hounds convinced them it didn't matter. "Oh, wow, that's not," she started. She gave up when shirts and pants started landing in front of her. The soldiers continued stripping, too busy and flustered to take notice of her protest. "Oh, okay, that happened," she said, sounding annoyed. The soldiers looked at her fearfully, unable to understand how complying could make her mood worsen. Despite that, it also gave them hope her next order might be to put their pants back on. The tunnel was cold and drafty. Chapter 16. Communications. Prophets. Faced with a gaggle of naked men, I felt a deep sense of irritation. It would have been sufficient for them to hand over spare clothes. The hound next to me sensed my mood and growled, causing them to cower. I took pity then. I also recalled there were burning bodies behind us. Admittedly, it took them repeatedly looking behind me to do that, but it happened. I quickly put out the fires, which fortunately were still mainly at the clothes level. I felt like the scent of human barbecue would not help our dialogue. With that done, I took a moment to study the men in front of me. They were scared, and I'd been careless with my wording. I patted the hound. It relaxed after a moment, tail wagging. With such a charming disposition, I felt like his name should be Stalin. To my surprise, the name appeared above the hound's head. Shit, I'd named it. Putting accidentally naming a monster aside, I turned my focus back to the matter at hand. For reasons as yet mysterious, I'd woken up to find not only were there people in my dungeon, but my mana was dangerously low. The stress of the situation left me irritable, but it wasn't the men's fault. What I needed to focus on was the matter at hand. Everything else would have to wait until then. Relax for a few minutes. I have some things to do, I started, only to pause as a breeze kicked up. It wafted a particularly foul odor my way. One or more of them had definitely pissed themselves. Despite that, the worst part of it was the scent of unwashed flesh. Actually, wash up first. You're all a bit. I said. I'd meant to tell them to put their clothes on initially. Since they were naked anyway, it wouldn't hurt to have them get clean before dressing. I used my interface to raise a tile and depress the center before filling it with water like a tall horse trough. The set of actions were free, so I didn't hesitate, though I stopped short of making an actual bath. I had other concerns to address. Looking in my inventory, I found the items I'd taken, then checked my store. They'd populated there under a common goods heading. They were free, having no mana cost. Seeing that, I supplied the group with soap and was thankful one of them had been carrying it. That only one of them had soap was a touch disturbing to my more modern sensibilities. I put it aside and checked other aspects of the store. All the dungeon-related costs were still in keeping with what I'd encountered in the tutorial. What had changed was the amount and variety of terrain, decor, and items. The tutorial had been limited in scope and had no extras like the healing potion. Now I could buy them with mana or trade them like I had to the men. The ones I'd traded hadn't cost me anything. It seemed like it was covered by the system's contract function, which was interesting. The weakest of the physical healing variety like the one supplied would have cost me 1 mana each. The most expensive potion of that category was 15 mana. It could regenerate organs and limbs. That seemed like a big jump in power versus cost, but I didn't question it. This was definitely a gift horse situation. The most expensive potion overall was 25 mana and would turn someone into a dragon for a day. I couldn't see it being terribly practical in the dungeon. That didn't stop it from being badass, though. I realized I was getting distracted and shook off my urge to memorize my inventory. That could wait until after the men left. For the moment, I needed to keep checking my interface. After making the first deal, I'd been prepared to let them go, but they'd stayed huddled in fear. Instead of saying anything, I let them remain. I was still getting to know my interface. They could be used as guinea pigs if I turned up any features or abilities I didn't understand. Ominous as that would have sounded spoken aloud, I didn't have any serious ill intent toward them. I'd made up my mind to let them go alive, and I didn't plan to cause them harm. At the same time, I didn't hesitate to detain them either. It was a bit tempting to keep one or two. They weren't exactly chatty, but they might be the only people I encountered for a while. I gave up on the idea immediately. Duress would make them poor conversation partners at the very least. I didn't ponder the ethics of imprisoning someone versus going insane from isolation. Instead, I went back to studying my interface. The crafting tab had caught my attention. After selecting it, I found 3 sub-tabs. Craft, disassemble, and upgrade. Each subtab had 2 slots open. Trying to put a pair of boots into a craft tab slot produced an error tone. The disassemble panel indicated the materials the item would be broken into. It would break down into E-grade leather, waxed cotton thread, and a pattern. It took me a moment to realize why I thought something was weird with that list. I was accustomed to the notion of shoes with rubber soles. Looking at the ones in my inventory, I found an unfamiliar design. Instead of multiple materials, they were made wholly of leather. A thicker piece of hardened leather acted as the sole. With that sorted out, I put a pair of boots into an upgrade slot. An icon of the boot appeared with a little red indicator in the corner 1/5. I was 4 pairs of shoes short of increasing their quality from E6 to E10, which was the highest quality. I elected to disassemble 1 pair of boots out of curiosity. Sticking the pattern in a crafting interface slot, I was rewarded with 3 new boxes. They indicated the materials needed to make the boots. I didn't have enough, but that wasn't important for the moment. Knowing how the interface worked was the main point. With that settled, I moved the rest of the boots into the upgrade interface. A 1-minute timer appeared, and I okayed it to start. When it finished, the E10 boots looked new but otherwise unremarkable compared to the E6 boots. Wondering if something was different, I bought an extra E10 pair and stuck them in the disassemble panel. I studied the result, but everything came up the same. The pattern was even labeled duplicate. There did seem to be a minor difference in craftsmanship quality, but I wasn't an expert. I couldn't tell if slightly smaller stitches were much of an improvement. With better quality or at least new goods in hand, I could have stopped. Instead, I started a new round of experimentation. It was time to give the upgrade option a try. Pattern upgrade E to D. 10 pairs E10 grade boots. I bought more boots and okayed the upgrade. My goal wasn't to increase the men's comfort. I wanted to learn about my interface, and they were just a convenient test group. Armed with a new pattern, I went back to the crafting tab but hit a wall. To make D-grade boots, I needed D-grade materials. It wasn't a complicated issue to overcome, but it did take a few minutes. Once I sorted the materials out and finished the crafting phase, I was rewarded with D-grade boots. D-grade boots that looked remarkably similar to E-grade boots. It took a few comparison passes for me to realize that the new ones had a right and a left. The old ones had been cut in a general foot shape which would fit both feet equally poorly. Without feet or a human standard sense of touch, I couldn't compare the two effectively. Seeing the questionable state of the men's socks, I quickly upgraded a pair to D10 quality. It was time to employ the guinea pigs. Speaking of the men, I found them huddled in fear and still somewhat wet. The air in the tunnel was dry, but it was a cold space, so they weren't drying. Looking through their stuff, I couldn't find anything like a towel. I resorted to disassembling a tunic and upgrading it to create a usable fabric. "Use this to dry off," I said as I passed out the towels. While they were doing that, I took the time to upgrade their other clothes and underwear. "Now get dressed," I said as I placed outfit sets in front of them. It had occurred to me a bit late, but having them only put on shoes would have been super weird. I could have given them the dirty ones back, but that made something in my pseudo-flesh squirm. "Those clothes should be burned if anything. Let me know if those clothes seem better than your old ones, the boots in particular," I said. There was a bit of cursing and some do-overs. In the end, they all seemed surprised by the excellent fit once they figured out the right foot/left foot issue. "They're nice," someone answered after a while. Others murmured in agreement, and I started to feel confident. Though the upgrade was minor, it had made a noticeable difference to the people who used the goods. That was a big deal. Good, I wanted to make sure," I muttered, talking to myself. With that established, I put the slots to work and made sure to process the Bandits' gear. A lot of that had been burned beyond use, but some of it was still salvageable. The D-grade items I made still populated under the common goods heading and were free. I could have kept going with upgrading things but didn't bother. I understood how it worked and could play later when I didn't have any time constraints. Walk around a little to make sure they don't pinch or anything, I added like a mother in a shoe store. Since I'd been handing them out without making adjustments, I'd expected some sets not to fit. Instead, it seemed like the system automatically sized them to the person. That seemed like a handy feature, to be sure. It did have a potential downside. If I were selling things or passing them through other people, then they wouldn't fit. That was a concern for later, though. I wouldn't be opening a dungeon discount mall anytime soon. I'd run out of interface issues to test. I only had a few options after all. Despite that, I didn't release the men right away. I was woefully ignorant about the world and my immediate environment. There were things I needed to know, and they were my only source of information. Despite that, I felt reluctant to keep them for a prolonged interrogation. Just coming up with the essential questions I needed to ask could take days. A deal interface appeared offering an information exchange contract. I felt my orbs flicker. I'd had no idea I could acquire knowledge in such a convenient manner. I would exploit the hell out of this. I could feel it in my pseudo-flesh and giggled. Ahem, I said once I noticed how my giggle had unnerved the men. I'm going to offer you another deal, I said. I didn't want to alarm them needlessly, and they'd seemed surprised the first time I sent them one. The terms of the deal automatically generated looked acceptable to me. Still, I decided to tweak the reward a bit. The first one had offered healing potions, but this time only money was indicated. I felt like that was a bit shabby since they were on the outskirts of a desert. Goods would be more helpful. They were also people from a swords and sorcery world, so I felt a very RPG-oriented desire to kit them out. They felt like starting characters who'd rolled shit treasure to me. I laughed again. That impulse in my knowledge of games suggested I'd played them to a nearly unhealthy level when I'd been human. Offer. 70 silver coins. 5 copper coins. Savix Soldier Uniform X2, Grade D1. Socks X4, D1. Backpack of Survival Gear, Grade D1. Sun Hat, Large, Grade D1. Spear, Grade D1. Long Knife, Grade D1. Round Shield, Small, Grade D1. In exchange for map data, ongoing, and knowledge. Accept, yes/no. By the goddess of mercy's tits, one of them shouted as he jammed the accept on the contract as fast as he could. The others were a little slower, distracted by his outburst. They all agreed the moment they figured out what the deal offered. With unanimous agreement achieved, they each received their new gear. I also dumped out their personal items on top of the neat piles they received. I wasn't interested in collecting strangers' mementos. Hey, can any of you use a bow? I asked. I'd found a longbow in the bandits' goods, but none of them carried ranged weapons, so I hadn't included one in the deal. And no, but if there's one, we'd like it. As proof, and maybe a head, one of the men answered. Proof of what? I asked, taken aback. That they're dead. We chased them down on orders, he explained. I paused, grossed out by the idea. Looking at the bodies then the men, I felt reluctant to comply. I'd just gotten the soldiers to bathe and put on new clothes after all. Despite that, in the end, I took the 2 corpses with identifiable faces and passed them over along with a bow. The soldiers made short work of beheading them. I provided cloth to wrap the heads in and felt a bit sick to whatever passed for a stomach in my case. Well, not to be rude, but you can go ahead and piss off now, I said bluntly. Seeing the butchering up close really wasn't sitting well with me. The men looked at me in surprise before bolting to their feet and running for the exit. I felt my orbs flutter. That they hadn't needed to be told twice was expected. How quickly they acted on it was shocking, though. Seems like someone put ranks into run the fuck away, I said, then laughed. Or took the fuck it I'm out feat, I added. Very droll, mistress, Stalin said with an eye roll. His voice was surprisingly deep, especially since I'd had no idea he could talk. Ah! I shouted. Chapter 17. Glad tidings. Yo can talk. I asked Stalin. So can I, his companion chimed in with a feminine voice. Stalin was stoic-faced most of the time. In contrast, the lady looked like she was grinning, jaws wide and tongue lolling. Is that? Nice to meet you, I almost asked if it was normal. As if anything about my current situation was or should be. At the very least, it seemed my conversation partner issue was dealt with. A pleasure. The lady hound said, knocking into Stalin when he remained silent. Mistress, may I kill the remaining one? Stalin asked, ignoring his partner. Remaining, I looked over toward the entrance. Fucking really. The unconscious man was still lying where he'd been before and bleeding out. The unopened potion bottle in the shape of an anatomical heart rested at his elbow. No, not for the moment, I said. Stalin rolled his burning eyes at me. Even so, he laid down without protest. His face full of what I now felt was a dog's equivalent of a bored expression. I floated over to get a look at the straggler. He was muscular and tanned but still had baby fat on his face. He looked 18 at the outside and would have definitely been carded trying to buy beer. He was worth points, but I didn't have an express reason to kill him at the moment. Nature would handle that shortly. Arrows in the body are not conducive to living. I felt bad since I'd let the others off. It seemed kind of rude to kill him just because they ditched him. He was also a kid in my eyes, which added to my reluctance. Deciding to do what I wanted, I fed him the potion then pulled the arrow out of his shoulder. Oh, shit, I said when the shaft came out sans arrowhead. That definitely wouldn't be good for his long-term health. Gingerly I used my claws to rip his shirt open at the wound site. I should have started by doing that, but now I could only try to fix the mess I'd made. I weighed my options. I could probably dig it out and use another potion to heal him again. The idea made my insides churn uncomfortably. I'd picked Dungeon Master because I didn't want to get bloody. Digging around in this kid's meat, even for medical reasons, didn't appeal to me. While I was trying to talk myself into it, he started groaning in pain. I thought he was waking up, but his eyes only fluttered as his wound bled more fiercely than before. Did I fuck up and give him a bad potion? The thought crossed my mind, but a moment later, something black began wriggling out of his flesh. Revolted, I pulled my hand away and was treated to the sight of the arrowhead pushing its way out of the wound. Once that horrible reverse birth was done, his flesh started to mend. As I watched, his bloodless face gained back a touch of color. He didn't wake up, but he looked a couple of steps further from death's door than he had before. It looked like the potion healed in a more profound sense than I'd anticipated. Convenient, I muttered. That the potion had corrected for my fuck-up was ideal and good to know. I'd passed out the cheapest physical healing potions, so I hadn't expected a lot. Having my expectations exceeded was nice. With the kid less likely to die of his own volition, that left him in my dungeon until he woke up. That wasn't exactly ideal. I considered tossing him out, but it made me feel cheap. Since I was sparing his life, it wasn't exactly kosher to then throw him out to suffer in the elements. Welcome to the dungeon hotel, I muttered to myself as I started shuffling tiles. Out of raid status, it didn't cost me anything to move them. I quickly had a small room built off to one side. It was hardly luxurious, but it would keep him out of the draft. Getting him into it was a different kind of problem. I tried dragging him, but it didn't work. Weirdly though, lifting him did. Getting down next to him, I loaded him on my stomach and slid like a sled to the spot where I wanted to put him. Thinking about why I could pick him up when I couldn't drag him felt like an ice pick in my brain. I decided to ignore it. I was made of Z14, and whatever that was didn't give a fuck. Getting so close, I discovered that this kid was the owner of the soap. He still smelled a bit, but more in the dear God shower after the gym kind of way instead of like bad meat or good cheese. Still unpleasant, but more tolerable by a few orders of magnitude. I bought a survival pack and deployed the bedroll before laying him down. The rest of the gear I left as it was, placing the bag next to him. I felt confident he'd piss off on his own once he woke up. If he was lucky, he might even catch up to his comrades before they got too far. I wouldn't have bet on the second half though, they likely hadn't stopped running yet. I wasn't sure if I'd accidentally given his stuff to someone else and checked my inventory. The pack with soap in it was still there, and the only unique item in it was 2 bags of candy. That left the stuff that was on him to go through. I put a blanket over him before stealing everything he was wearing. I could have waited until he woke up and asked him to disrobe politely. Only I suspected that would end with a needless fight on my hands. His basic gear was the same as his comrades'. The only notable deviation was a sword and heavy belt where the sheath was hung. The others only had spears, which made sense. Swords were generally expensive and training intensive, despite fantasy movie depictions. Spears were a semester of stick them with the pointy end. Swordsmanship was a master's degree. Aside from the sword and the candy, his only personal item was a locket. In one half was a painting of an older woman holding a baby. It was done in a mushy sort of pre-Renaissance realistic style. It looked cheap and poorly done to me, but sitting for a portrait of any size was a luxury. It also might have been good workmanship based on the local art level. In the other half of the locket, behind glass, was a coiled braid of blonde hair. It matched the boy's, which made me think it was his mother's. I knew that assumption was biased. If it belonged to the woman in the portrait, she could have been an older wife. Or a younger woman painted without skill. On the outside of the locket, a coat of arms was etched. A rose with a pair of arrows crossed behind it with the heads pointed down. It matched the one on the sword's crossguard, and my curiosity about the kid grew. "Who's a baby paladin?" I asked jokingly. "Blonde-haired, square-jawed, martial training, humble station, and a complicated past." I tried to stop myself from thinking about it, but it was too late. Seeds long dormant in my heart were starting to sprout, an ominous rattle of dice heralding their awakening. This kid had a backstory. I pushed down my sudden desire to ask him 100 questions. A task greatly helped by the fact he was still unconscious. Until he woke up, I resolved to leave him alone and get to the work I should have started already. Putting the locket back on him, I still kept the sword for the moment. Weirdly, it didn't populate to my item store, and I was curious as to why. The investigation into that would have to wait. Since I was done dealing with my guest, it was time to figure out what had happened to my mana. I opened my dungeon layout interface, and my jaw would have dropped if it wasn't decorative. My starter set of tiles included 150 generated based on the local terrain. The ones I'd gotten as a bonus from the tutorial amounted to 75. The grand total of titles that I owned at present was 1,685. My core had absorbed 1,460 tiles during startup. I couldn't help but fist pump at that. Chapter 18. Flickering Anxiety. Despite my joy at the massive number of tiles I had, I knew it wasn't time for a celebration. I had 15 mana to my name, and going by the fact I had an E-grade core, I should have had 100. That was when I remembered the error tones and how I hadn't been able to read anything earlier. I tried to get the prompts I'd thrown to the side to reappear. I cycled through every mental command I could think of until finally, Alert History did the trick. A prompt appeared with a list of the most recent alerts. I wasn't sure where to start but noticed a generic error repeated several times and picked it. Alert. Action cancelled due to insufficient mana. That wasn't precisely illuminating, but it fit timeline-wise when I tried to buy tiles. Nothing after it had a title that led me to believe it would shed additional light. That left something weird I didn't know about, or my tile purchase going horribly awry. Build log. I said, hoping it was a feature. A pop-up appeared but was blank for a moment. Text shimmered in and out of existence before finally deciding to stick. Most of it was various tile coordinates from the startup phase. The mass of numbers took a little time to understand. I found what I needed just before I deployed the elemental hounds by the timestamps. Exterior plot purchase. 2 spaces, 20 mana, raid penalty. 6 spaces, 60 mana, raid penalty. My relief was immense. Going by the costs, my pathetic remaining mana made almost perfect sense. 5 were still unaccounted for, but I felt confident I'd find the reason soon enough. Exterior plot purchase. I hadn't done anything of the sort in the tutorial. I'd converted tiles but only from an underground source at the time. Going by that and how my core would dig in if I didn't place it underground, I'd assumed the surface was off limits. I was deeply pleased to find out I was wrong. Having access to the surface would give me a lot of exciting options for building my dungeon. Building, I needed to get to work on it, but not just yet. Digging around the 5-point drop corresponded timestamp-wise to deploying the hounds. I checked and found the problem in their species description. Without a high-heat environment setup, they would draw mana to make up for the deficiency. I hadn't paid attention to that during the tutorial since it was in a lava tube-based dungeon. It would have been problematic to make a cold spot, not supply a hot one. While I was on the subject of the hounds, there were a couple of things I needed to address before proceeding. Something I hadn't had the spare brain cells to contemplate before. The majority of my mind had been in panic mode over my mana. So, I named you Stalin before I realized you could talk or anything. I'll undo that and give you one you had before. Or one you want, I offered. It wasn't an apology, but I wanted to get the first bit out of the way. I felt like knowing someone planned to make amends made the apology process smoother. No need, I like the sound of it. We identify by scent and call, we accept names to make it easier on our masters, Stalin said simply. I looked to his companion, uncertain of how to feel about anything. I feel the same. It's fun to learn what the names mean and why you give them, she said, grinning or showing her teeth at me, amused either way. Okay, well, is there anything you'd like? I have some tiles free, so I'll set up your zone now, I offered. I'd like to kill the male, Stalin said, tail wagging. For all that he was being a good boy and listening, he seemed to have a one-track mind. It was kind of cute if you didn't think too hard about the murder part. I want a pool, the female shouted. She stood up, bouncing in place and yapping to punctuate the sentence. A pool? I asked, startled. The hottest you can manage, deep enough to dive in, she clarified. I'd like a shallow part to lounge in, Stalin said, seeming to forget his bloodlust for a moment. Yeah, I'll put it in the lowest level, so I was cut off again as both hounds went dashing off down the tunnels racing toward the lava pool I had yet to construct. I had meant to say I'd build it after the system refresh. I had to choose between disappointing them and a speed build challenge. Challenge accepted. Building a pool wasn't hard, and I dropped 6 tiles of the barrier-type lava flow a few miles away from my core. It wouldn't be harmed by it, but I didn't like putting dangerous things too close to it. I used my control interface to reduce 2 of the tiles to a lounging depth. The automatic 10-foot depth was already suitable for diving. I left that alone but moved some spaces around to create a high ceiling. With the basics of their request met, I checked their progress on the map. They were almost to the new area. Since I wasn't pressed for time now, I decided to get creative. First, I put in a waterfall of lava flowing down a rock face like a slide. Next to that was a small outcropping to use as a diving spot into the deepest part. Next came some of the basalt stones to act as stairs leading in and as decor around it. By the time the hounds arrived, it looked like a proper bit of hell to play in. Fear me, for my interior design skills are legend. I cackled happily to myself. Feeling revived by that fun little project, I was ready to tackle getting my dungeon set up. Unfortunately, the first step wasn't buying things or manipulating them. House cleaning and research were. I needed to finish reading all of the notices from when I'd been ill to start with. On the bright side, my anxiety was gone. When the refresh came, I would be ready to get shopping and building. Since the mystery of my low mana was solved, that left me curious about points. How they were earned hadn't been covered in the tutorial. The HUD had indicated they came of deaths in the dungeon. With that in mind, I turned my attention to the death reports. Death report. Fill up, NN, +1. This one had stood out to me, but I couldn't figure out precisely what the +1 was for. I wanted it to be points, but there was no visible indication for that. My points? I said to no effect. I tried a few other variations before finally, a small counter appeared above my clock. It was grayed out, though, so I was still in the dark about what the +1 meant. I decided that didn't matter and kept checking the notices. I had a couple more death ones to get through. Death report. Jax, NE, +0. Without warning, I heard a ding, and suddenly the counter changed from grayed out to active with a -1 count. Fuck. Fuck a duck. Fuck a fucking duck. I had no idea why I was starting in the negative, and I felt like screaming. Going by the deaths I'd already looked at, I should have had a positive score. Scared, I kept reading. Death report. Tip, CE, -2. Tip, whoever the fuck he'd been, had screwed me hard. I gathered my courage and went back to reading. Death report. Durst, NN, +1. Angry, I felt like trying to figure out which of these fuckers was Tip. He was one of the bandits, and I found the other listed names in the process. Despite my anger, there wasn't anything I could do to or about a dead man. I went back to reading. Death report. Rastin, LN, +3. Corey, NG, +3. Those names threw me off. I couldn't figure out where they were until I remembered the exterior purchase. Looking at those tiles, I found a pair of the Savix soldiers lying dead. Both slain by arrows. Maybe I was wrong, and the deaths weren't the cause of the points. I should have been at 6 points, not still negative. No, going by the math, I should have never been negative. I had to be missing something. Maybe the number represented potential points. I could have something I needed to do to harvest them. I looked at the point tally accusingly and found it had turned grey and zeroed out again. I felt my orbs flicker. What the actual fuck? Chapter 19. Problematic reporting. Finally, after half an hour, the points counter stabilized and showed +6 halves. It looked like the deaths were the cause, and something had been wrong with the counter. That was a relief. Mostly anyway. On the one hand, it was good that I was right. Points were gathered by an easily understood if objectionable method. That parts of the system could malfunction was less than ideal. I decided to focus on the fact that I had 4 points more than the required 2 for my tithe. That was soothing. As for why I looked the reports over and could only guess at the odd tagging. If I were in a betting mood, I'd have laid a pretty hefty amount on the N standing for neutral, C for chaos, E for evil, L for lawful, and finally G for good. As I considered that, the death reports shimmered briefly before revealing just what I had suspected. Now spelled out clearly instead of abbreviated. It also looked like I lost points for killing those of my own alignment but gained them for any other. That was definitely something I'd have to be careful about since I couldn't filter who entered my dungeon. At least not at the moment. I'd have to look into it. Feeling better, I wanted some additional information. When it came to interface and system matters, they were something I couldn't do anything about on my own. I tried summoning some kind of help desk or ticket system. Since the system was following a similar pattern to a game interface, I felt like it should have a Q&A section. Despite rephrasing the idea multiple times, nothing happened. It seemed like there wasn't such a function or that I didn't have access to it. That reminded me of the notice about the text-to-speech function for the interface. I had to upgrade to gain access to it. Maybe other features would unlock or improve if I put points into them. That wasn't ideal, but at least it would potentially improve. Thinking of points, now that I had some, I could use the excess in the store. The point buy section had been a grayed out tab during the tutorial, but now it opened easily. I began browsing excitedly, wondering what kind of cool shit they'd have on offer. If I could get a potion of regrowing limbs for 15 mana, then points should net me some pretty awesome things. 4 minutes into my search, I was disappointed. The majority of point items for sale were core upgrades and features. They were all practical in nature but not the powers cosmic I'd been envisioning before. The only one that really had anything to do with aesthetics was the ability to change my core's appearance. I shamelessly played with that one for a while but didn't buy it in the end. As rad as making my core look like a giant dragon's eye was, I couldn't justify the expense. Once I got over my disappointment and stopped screwing around, I approached the options with more tempered expectations. As far as utility went, the choices were pretty good. The best would have been to upgrade the core's quality from E rank to D rank. Unfortunately, it cost a stomach-churning 100 points. There was also a mystery component required, but I couldn't find out what at the moment. The entry was grayed out without so much as a tooltip to explain things. At a guess, I needed to have the points on hand or fulfill a mystery requirement to know more. Possibly both. The affordable upgrades were increased mana output, increased durability, increased hardness, and minimize. Suffering from a bit of PTSD from the tutorial, I leaned toward minimize. If I maxed it out, my core would be the size of a large apple at the end. Good luck hitting that fucking archers. It wasn't a practical choice at the moment, though. Not when I had so few points. I put it on a list to buy later when I was less strapped. I studied the other options in more depth. Increased hardness was similar to armor. It would make the core more challenging to damage in the first place. Conversely, increased durability would give it extra hit points. They made for a good combo paired together. Both were a good thing, but I flinched at the idea of letting someone get close enough to take a shot like that. I would be a lot happier if they never got that far in. That left increased mana output. It would grant me an extra 50 mana per day at refresh. That would give me a lot of room to play and better overall versatility than everything but a core rank upgrade. The only trouble was that it cost 10 points. Shit. Everything looked good, but the two things I actually wanted were too expensive. I closed the shop tab. I felt reluctant not to buy anything since I didn't know if I'd lose all my extra points at the end of the year or not. Despite that, I didn't want to spend them on things I didn't really want then find out I kept them. Remembering the issue I had with the interface, an alternative occurred to me. It only cost 1 point to upgrade the last time a prompt for it had appeared. Upgrade interface, I said, and the confirmation screen showed up. What do I get? I asked. The prompt expanded to show an outline of what I'd receive for my 1 point. This felt like another bit of weirdness, and the fact the new information was in a different font from the rest of the system felt like it confirmed my hunch. Interface upgrade level 1 to level 2. Cost, 1. Interface quality increase, F1 to F2 grade. Store interface increase, F1 to F2 grade. Crafting interface grade increase, F1 to F2. Communications enabled. I had an E grade core but an F grade interface. I didn't know how to feel about that. For 1 point, it was a good deal just to enable communications. Both Agony and the Hood had indicated that we could talk to each other, but I hadn't seen how with my current setup. If it also happened to include a support desk, I'd be ecstatic. Even if it didn't, though, the other upgrades were probably worth it on their own. Crafting, in particular, interested me. I made up my mind to upgrade but closed the prompt. I needed to set up proper defenses before diving into that. There was no way to know until I triggered it, but I'd undergone a blackout period when I initialized my core. That had been an unavoidable risk at the time, but that wasn't the case now. It was time to get to work. Though I had almost no mana to speak of, it was easy to rearrange existing tiles. A few careful stalactite and stalagmite placements and the entry tunnel was nearly impassable. It wasn't enough to entirely prevent entry. I didn't want to set off a build alarm, but it discouraged idle curiosity. I wove in garbage grade traps I'd gotten from the tutorial since they had few placement requirements. Though it wasn't much, my new defenses significantly improved over the prior complete lack of them. I changed the tunnels around so they'd be confusing to navigate due to monotony and doubling back. So long as an actual adventurer didn't find me, I felt confident most people would end up hopelessly lost. Despite the improvements, I didn't make a move to upgrade yet. I wasn't short on points, which meant I could take my time. I could afford to spend a day or so building things up more securely. With that in mind, I turned my attention to researching the monsters available to me. Their needs and wants would be the guiding principle behind a lot of my layout choices. Aesthetics were important to me, but function would be the limitation that dictated how I developed the form. Getting into the zone as I read, my hand started to unconsciously move. I wanted to take notes, and it felt like a habit which was kind of weird. I understood what and why I was doing it but had no idea why it seemed so natural. Someone was a research nerd, I muttered derisively to myself. I wasn't her. At least not in a meaningful sense, but I couldn't help curiosity. My life started while hers ended as a ride-share driver having a shit day. Everything up to that moment, including the decision to work a gig job, had been her choice. Everything after it had been mine. Was that her first day? What would she think knowing how things had turned out? Was this a turn of events she could have lived with? I had lots of questions but no way of finding answers. Knowing there was nothing to be done, I got back to what I had been doing. My hand moved to take notes again, and I wished I had some way of writing. Knowing that things would sometimes reveal themselves if I found the correct command, I gave it a try. After a few tries, a black pen had appeared along with a blank white prompt. Curious, I started writing and found it worked like paper. My handwriting flowed smoothly as I played around with some quick doodles. Eager to put the new feature to work, I picked some monsters and jotted down their relevant details. Treating it like a sticky note, I felt more confident I wouldn't make pointless mistakes about placement. Traps went next and were just as complex in their needs. Once I had a good grasp of them, I started formulating a plan. Sketching out a general layout map, I marked down where I wanted to place things, then wrote what they needed next to them. If a section needed certain features or a specific size, I mapped it out. My shorthand was to fill the area with slanted lines to indicate it wasn't done yet. To meet those needs, I harvested tiles from the existing layout and moved them around. Once the floor plan met the minimum requirements, I started doing the subtle alterations to the spaces to make them work. The work was repetitive but in a zen kind of way rather than tedious. Essential defenses came together painlessly. I had a rock-solid foundation to work from, thanks to the tutorial. It had lacked advanced tactical advice, but I wasn't starting from scratch. By the time refresh was about to hit, I was confident that no randos would be able to walk in and kick in my core. When my mana refreshed, I felt a soothing sense of calm. I wasn't broke and nearly helpless. I did still have a house guest, though. Weighing my options, I decided it would probably be better to wait until he left to do an upgrade. Several minutes after reaching that very logical conclusion, my more base nature made some persuasive arguments to the contrary. Yes, I could wait, but I had no idea how long it would take. The kid was a potential threat, but I'd beefed up my defenses, and 4 bandits hadn't been enough to take on my hounds. What was one kid going to do? Thinking of the hounds, I decided to pay them a visit. They were down in the lava area I'd hastily set up, enjoying themselves. I found Stalin lounging in the pool while the lady hound was jumping off the diving rock I'd set up. She was most of the way down when I realized a fundamental problem with the scenario. Wow, I started only to fall silent as she plunged into the pool. Instead of smacking into a solid, she splashed down like it was water. I felt my orbs flicker as I stared in confusion. Lava wasn't a thin liquid. She shouldn't have been able to do that. Mistress! Stalin called from where he was sitting. He was covered in lava and shook it from his coat before walking over to me. His stately bearing marred by enthusiastic tail wags. So, I was thinking about upgrading my interface. I started only to trail off. The lady hound was doggy paddling over to us, which was another what the fuck visual to take in. Maybe it was a thing she could do because she was an elemental. I wanted to ask but didn't. I felt like the answer would be magic, duh, or a blank look, and I wasn't prepared for either thing spiritually. You have enough points to do that? I didn't think that lot would be worth much, Stalin asked. Wait, you know how many points I should get? I countered. Somehow I was more surprised by this than the fact he could talk in the first place or that lava was weird in my dungeon. I don't know exactly, but my previous masters always cursed if they killed certain types of people. They complained they weren't worth anything. Did I misunderstand? Stalin answered, the other one nodding in agreement. This isn't the first dungeon you've been in? I asked. One question leading to another yet again. This is my third, Stalin said, still confused by my reaction. My second. I was captured as a pup and bound to the system, Stalin's companion said. The name thing really needed to be addressed soon. I was older. You did well to level to such an extent from a pup. Most never mature, Stalin said, and his companion nodded. I'd assumed that monsters were spawned by the system itself, not organically occurring creatures added to it. That felt shittier on a certain level. Do either of you know what happens when someone upgrades? I blacked out for a while when I initialized my core, and I'm worried that will happen again, I asked honestly. It wouldn't do me any good to pretend I wasn't anxious and avoid asking. Both hounds looked at me for a moment, then at each other. They might not have witnessed the event, but I hoped they had. Mine always thrashed around on the ground for a while, the lady hound replied. The same with mine the few times I observed it, Stalin agreed. Oh, like an hour or two? I asked, feeling a bit relieved. If it was that short a time, it wouldn't be a big deal to upgrade now. What's an hour? The lady hound asked. I looked at Stalin. He didn't seem to know either. So the time it takes to say one Mississippi is about a second. 60 seconds is a minute, and there are 60 minutes in an hour, I explained. Lots of minutes, not an hour, the lady hound said emphatically. Stalin agreed with a nod and a woof for emphasis. That made sense, neither one of them seemed to have that long of an attention span. Minutes were even better for my needs, so I didn't mind a bit. Okay then, I'm going to upgrade. You guys guard the core, okay? I asked. Yes, mistress. The hounds said in unison. Feeling reassured, I reopened the upgrade interface and selected yes. A timer appeared, and I felt nervous as it crawled forward. I'd had no idea how long 10 seconds could feel when you truly weren't looking forward to something. Chapter 20. Revelatory Vertigo. As the zero flashed and faded, I felt a vibration pass through my pseudo-flesh. It started light, like a massage chair, and rapidly progressed to jackhammer level. The world around me seemed to shake apart at the same time, revealing something glowing and strange underneath. Letters or runes I didn't recognize lit up in a multitude of colors. They appeared and faded like the twinkle of stars as I felt an unrelenting wave of nausea. The runes disappeared, and I found my nose clotted with the smell of flesh and blood. Before me was a tangle of limbs forming a single complex array. I wondered how many living beings had died to make it, and knew I'd never know the answer. The numbers didn't match up. The number of legs was uneven, and there were more arms than legs. The hands waved at me cheerfully while the legs remained aloof. When I came to, I found myself looking into a burning pair of eyes, just before Stalin licked my face. I had no idea what was going to happen going in, but was still surprised. Huzzah! Are you well, mistress? Stalin asked, nose coming close to my face but not quite touching. It was an interesting question, and I wasn't sure of the answer. I wasn't in pain. My body seemed fine. Too fine, really, as if nothing had happened, which was disturbing in its own right. That was a thing. Are you two all right? I asked as I sat up. The lady hound was sitting back and to the left of Stalin. We're fine, the lady hound said. She seemed curious, but hesitant to approach me. Her personality was outgoing, but she was having a shy moment, which was cute. Your orbs burned bright, and you thrashed around for a while, Stalin informed me bluntly. He leaned in and inspected me closely. I reached up to pet him, and he leaned into it, so I scratched his head. The coarse stone felt velvety to my dim sense of touch. The lady hound watched us and started to fidget, then barked. I didn't know what she wanted and looked at Stalin for help. She'd like a scratch too, Stalin clarified. I held a hand out to her. She hesitated, then ran right up to me. Between her and Stalin, I was overwhelmed. Elemental hounds, lava dogs, it didn't matter what you called them. Any sort of dog liked a scratch, and that was a universal constant I could get behind. Velvety and warm, the hounds felt soothing to pet. I kept it up until I felt less weirded out by the upgrade. I couldn't remember what happened clearly, but there was a lingering disquiet I didn't feel like dealing with by myself. Once I felt better, I checked the time. It looked like the upgrade had taken 5 minutes. That wasn't a lot of time, but I'd felt like it had taken hours. I disentangled myself from the hounds and took inventory of the changes to my interface. Previously, my display had nothing but the timer, unless I opened a specific interface. Now I had a series of icons in a top bar and tabs down the left side. The tabs were the same ones from my interface. It was a nice organizational touch. I almost missed a small marble under the timer. When I looked at it, a countdown to refresh appeared. I could see I had several hours left at a glance. I could do the math with the regular countdown, but I hated math, so this was nice. Along the top bar, the icons included an envelope, a person with a heart, a bell, and a magnifying glass. The message envelope and person with a heart had a red dot next to each. It wasn't good to get distracted. Yet, like a lemming, I immediately selected the friend's request. Agony and someone named Steve had both applied to be my friend. I immediately accepted Agony's request but chose to look at Steve's profile first. The name was too basic under the circumstances. A profile popped up, but it didn't contain any useful information. There wasn't much in it, just the name and a picture. I'd have denied it, but there was something about the little square of darkness that pulled at me. It felt like it was smiling in a familiar unenthusiastic way. Holy shit, I muttered, realizing my abyss in a robe recruiter was named Steve of all things. How, and why, were my first thoughts. Fuck, it was my third. His name was Steve, and it made as much sense as anything was going to. I was giggling. He looked like a mopey middle schooler on picture day. How I knew so from what looked like a blank box wasn't a mystery worth exploring for the moment. I accepted Steve's friend request and then checked my texts. Agony had sent me a picture of an ass-backward layout someone had constructed in the tutorial. Under it was a video clip of the architect freaking out and demanding to know why the heroes won. FML was the heading. I wrote Agony back right away, since I felt like he could use some cheering up. Customer-facing jobs were always shit. Hey! That guy sounds like a douche. Hope he's not still being rude to you. I've had a crazy day, sending you the logs so you can see. If you want to come hang out, feel free. I installed a pool. The message was brief, and I hesitated to send it. Reasonably, if Agony could send images, then it was possible I could too. The system complied and I heard a click, followed by a smaller pop-up filled with the image of what I'd been looking at. Sweet. Playing around, I tried doing it while I had the security feed open and found I could take pictures of myself selfie style that way. Pleased with the development, I decided to play around. Since I mentioned the pool, I enlisted the hounds and got them to pose. "Join us, mistress," the lady hound insisted. Curious, I reached down to touch the lava. Mind-bendingly, it behaved like water when I scooped up a handful and even let me submerge. Deciding not to think too hard about the cartoon physics at work, I just went with it. The final image I attached was of me and the hounds lounging next to the lava fall I hastily edited in next to the diving rock. The old layout had been alright, but it lacked the right kind of aesthetics for a good photo. I also included the event log entries to show how nuts my day had been. My aim wasn't to compare miseries, but I thought he'd find it funny. Nothing like waking up from integration to find intruders to get whatever ichor blood equivalent I had pumping. Done with that, I almost closed the message interface but thought better of it. Steve had sent me a friend request but no message. It was probably okay to leave that be, but I felt uneasy. I wasn't sure if contacting him was a good idea, despite him telling me I could, but it was more professional to do it. Particularly since he'd been reasonably friendly. "Hello Steve. I just wanted to let you know I'm getting settled in fine. Thank you for the opportunity." Woof. It was YAI too flat. I tried twice more before hitting on something that didn't sound like a corporate blowjob. "Hi Steve. I just got communication privileges. Thanks for befriending me. My core's in place, and I've even earned some points." This was definitely the better option for me over Demon Lord. Killing isn't pleasant, even when I don't do it myself, but I feel like I can handle this. Anyway, thanks. There should be a comma, but I haven't picked a name yet. I'll let you know when I do. I looked it over and felt better than I had about the previous versions. It might be a little too casual, but I thought that was better than being stiff. I sent the message and felt like a grown-ass adult for my basic professionalism. Getting back to exploring the icon bar, I had 2 left to go. The bell was a notice log and had all the prompts I'd looked at earlier in a drop-down grayed out as red. The last icon was a lookup function. Curious, I thought of sword and it brought back an encyclopedia article. A really long one with a crap ton of disambiguations for related articles. I was pleased by this development and considered it worth the cost of the upgrade on its own. I'd bought knowledge from the Savix soldiers, but I didn't really feel any different. A turn of events I didn't mind in light of finding the encyclopedia. So long as I had access to it, I was okay with it being added to the encyclopedia instead of my head directly. It wouldn't be the weirdest thing to have happened to me, but I didn't like stuff monkeying with my brain. My mind had already been messed with sufficiently for several lifetimes, in my opinion. Continuing my inspection, I found a few minor changes in the store and crafting interface. The store had expanded to include some new low-level monsters and decor options. Nothing earth-shattering, but it would give me some flexibility later. The crafting interface looked nicer, but I couldn't find a specific improvement outside of aesthetics. Wanting to test it out, I placed the kid's sword in the Deconstruct tab. Warning! Legendary item. Cost to dismantle, 15 mana. Yes/no. I felt my orbs flicker as I looked toward the kid. Even though I was staring through yards of stone, I knew I was looking dead at him. Yo-o-uri, a baby paladin.